Welcome, wrestling fans, to the Pro Wrestle Machine. Let's jump right into it. May 7, 2001 Wrestling Observer Newsletter, Career of Johnny Valentine by Dave Meltzer. The plight of Hall of Fame wrestler Johnny Valentine, with his death in the early morning hours of April 24, and legendary rival Wahoo McDaniel, brought home to many of their contemporaries the lack of care the profession takes to its own. McDaniel, 63, one of the biggest stars from the late 60s through the mid-80s, has been in poor health the past few years, nearly passing away at one point and needing regular kidney dialysis. While a huge star in his day, with his name coming up a lot over the past week with people's memories of Valentine, he's largely been forgotten in his profession, which except for the few older fans who have stuck around for the long haul and a very tiny percentage of current fans, have no interest in history of knowledge of wrestling's past. His few older fans left in the Carolinas were saddened the last time McDaniel appeared in front of the public at a major wrestling show, when Ricky McDaniel was getting a tryout for the WWF and Wahoo was in his corner at the Greensboro Coliseum, a building he headlined for years, that he went almost totally unnoticed by the audience. But McDaniel in a sense was one of the lucky ones. Before getting into pro wrestling, he played several years in the AFL, which became part of the NFL, long enough to qualify for the pension. While he was a far bigger star and made far more money for much longer in wrestling, it was the NFL Players Union that has kept him from being totally destitute. Valentine, like the vast majority of his contemporaries, had no such luck. A few years after his career ended in a plane crash that left him paralyzed from the waist down, the business had all but forgotten him. If this were to have happened today, there would have been some sort of flight insurance most likely, and Valentine would have collected a huge settlement. It's hard to say what is and isn't fair or right. Most wrestling companies lived hand to mouth in those days. Wrestlers came and went, quite frankly, as did wrestling companies. Most of the big ones that lasted for decades died in the 80s due to their inability to compete with the expanding big boys. There is no overseeing body, like a Screen Actors Guild, in wrestling, which ironically has taken care of many wrestlers that had bit parts in movies more than the profession, and made their names in as well. The truth is, much of life is about timing and luck. Ability certainly helps, but it's not as important as timing. Valentine was a big enough star in an era where he made good money, certainly not by the standards of the wrestlers and athletes today. That was just the standards of the athletes of his day, but a plane crash led to huge medical bills that left him destitute. Red Bastian, who lives in the Dallas area, went to see Valentine, who lived in Fort Worth, a few months back with another of his contemporaries, Ray Stern, who ended up leaving wrestling and making millions in aviation, and both cried after the visit. "We both had tears in our eyes," said Bastian, who was one of Valentine's greatest rivals and the recipient for some of his often not-so-lighthearted ribs, in matches that took place everywhere from Florida to California, most notable perhaps in Indiana and Texas. Ray said, "I don't think we'll ever see him alive again. Look at how many guys have died in our business the past 5 years," noted Ric Flair in an interview with Slam. Wrestling. Nobody ever mentions their names anymore. This is the most insensitive business in the world, and it will continue to be until somebody does something about it. We don't have the type of backing, be it union-wise or health insurance-wise, and the reason is because under the current system, everybody has to look out after themselves. It's hard to know exactly what is fair. When Brian Pillman died in October of 1996, the WWF paid his contract to his family through the end of that year. Because Pillman had a unique popularity, and had many friends in Cincinnati where he grew up as something of an underdog hero, the profession has helped out the family he left behind to a degree with the annual memorial show to raise money. But still, the financial plight Pillman's children faced after their father's early death is very sad. Many companies would have terminated the contract upon death, so it isn't to say WWF was fair or unfair in its handling of the situation. But with no unions and survivor benefits in a situation like this, there are heartbreaking stories nobody hears about. Quite frankly, the profession has remembered and taken care of Pillman's family far better than most. Louis Spicolli would be totally forgotten, except that Tommy Dreamer brings up his memory in almost every match. Rick Rude, who, while not being a figure who changed the face of the business like Pillman did, was actually a far bigger star, and has been almost totally forgotten. In the case of Valentine, promoter Jim Crockett Jr. did keep him on the payroll for about 18 more months, and he eventually went back to Texas, where he's lived since his career ended, and tried to be a manager for supposed brother Buddy Valentine, Dale Hay, known most of his career as Buddy Roberts, who gained later fame with the Freebirds, but it just didn't fit. Valentine couldn't do much from a wheelchair, and the fans who had seen him as one of the toughest and most dangerous men they'd seen since childhood weren't comfortable seeing him that way, either. The money he had saved from wrestling went to paying his mounting medical bills, and he was left to live on Social Security disability income. "It's a shame that somebody like John, the business ignored him," said reporter Mike Mooneyham in the Slam wrestling article, who grew up watching Valentine as the top star in the Carolinas. "I really can't state it any other way or sugarcoat it. His own business turned its back on him. It was cold and heartless. Especially for a guy like him, this was a guy that meant so much to the business. I would say he was one of the top 5 performers of my generation. In a business that has accumulated so much over the past few years, these things shouldn't happen." His death was never even acknowledged on WWF television over the past week. Valentine was an enigma in the profession. He was one of those performers, like Ray Stevens, who was a bigger legend to the wrestlers themselves than they even were to the fans. Even Lou Thesz, who normally doesn't have kind things to say about wrestlers who weren't actually skilled at wrestling, always put Valentine over as being physically tough. There was many a story he told in the Booker Hooker about Valentine, who grew up in Hobart, Washington, just outside of Seattle, where he was always built. Valentine was actually training to be a boxer at first, before he ended up as a teenager in wrestling and became one of its biggest stars. He had all wrestling ability, Thesz wrote, but he didn't need any, because he rose to the top on toughness and pure guts. Once you got past the hookers and the serious shooters, Johnny Valentine was probably the one man in professional wrestling you least wanted to mess with. The fans could sense his toughness too, and they always turned out in droves to see him. Thesz remembered that the wrestling office in Texas talked him into riding a Brahma bull at a stock show in Houston, because they felt the publicity would be good for business, as it was billed as the toughest man in wrestling, which was how Valentine was billed in those days, versus the toughest animal. Valentine, who had never done this sort of thing, still did it anyway. It was thrown rather quickly. But the animal then turned on him. The bull charged at him so quickly that Thesz, who was in the stands watching, remembered he thought Valentine for sure was going to wind up a goner. Valentine punched the bull right in the face as hard as he could. Thesz said you could hear the splat all over the building. The bull stopped dead in its tracks and tried to shake off the blow. This gave Valentine the momentary diversion for him to hop the fence and get out of trouble. Thesz also recalled a situation in California where Joe Pazandak, a very good actual wrestler, had a conflict with the office over money, went public and caused some trouble. Valentine, who for some reason was known as Cowboy Rocky Valentine in California even though he was by then already a big name as Johnny Valentine in many other places, was put in the ring with him. The match turned into a shoot, apparently, with Valentine stalling forever. When Pazandak tried some wrestling, Valentine hit him with a punch, cutting his eye. Pazandak again tried to shoot, but Valentine cut him over the other eye. Valentine literally beat the hell out of him with punches before it was stopped because Pazandak was bleeding so badly. Valentine was remembered for always having a blank stare, like he was in a trance, both in and out of the ring. There was a famous story about one night when he was walking around the ring with a blank stare, like a man so deep into the zone you couldn't get him out of it. A fan in the front row, hot at him for bailing out on the babyface's comeback, hit him with a sucker punch hard to the jaw. Valentine not only didn't go after the fan, but just kept walking, never even blinked or registered the blow, and never broke character. To do so would be to acknowledge that the match itself going on in the ring wasn't his 100% focus. "John was one of my heroes," said Dory Funk, who rated Valentine and Jack Briscoe as his favorite opponents of that era. "I learned a lot from him about working. I didn't wrestle his style, but I learned so much about taking care of myself in the ring presence, and what the fans wanted to see from him." The legend of Valentine is such that nobody ever hit harder than he, and wahoo! Memories are often kind, and whether his stiff blows were any different than many Japanese wrestlers or Chris Benoit today is as much conjecture as anything. As are the pops he drew because of his ability, whether playing face or heel, and he was equally successful at either role, although the MO was usually to come in as a heel, and when the fans respected him so much for being the toughest SOB around, turn face without changing the style much except doing more early selling to build the comeback. While he was by no means anywhere close to the promo man Steve Austin was, the perception of the fans of what Valentine was probably was the closest similarity today. The heel who never backed down, who became a super babyface because the fans believed in him with the turn. But if he turned back, they accepted that because they knew he was never anyone to be trusted. Without the promo ability of an Austin, Valentine had to work his magic 100% in the ring. But even after the heart attack in 1973, once he came back a few months later, it wasn't as if he was moved down cards for being past his prime. The loudest crowd I ever heard was when he beat Harley Race for the Missouri State title, January 19, 1973 in St. Louis, recalled longtime St. Louis television announcer and Sam Muchnick's assistant Larry Matuzik on Wrestling Observer Live's Valentine special show on April 24, who recalled the pop when he made the announcement of the title change. "I was deaf for 2 days after the match. Soon after winning that title, he was booked to lose in a match with Terry Funk. In a match at the Chase Hotel, Funk hit Valentine's knee with a chair to lead to the spinning toe hold finish. Fans in St. Louis were furious, since using chairs wasn't done in that promotion up until that point in time. Valentine was a huge face being screwed out of the title, but Muchnick hated it because he was trying to keep wrestling away from gimmicks, believing they hurt long-term business by killing credibility. As it turned out, the two never had the rematch, which Valentine would have almost surely won since Muchnick was hot at Funk for using the chair because of the heart attack 2 days before the match. Muchnick never went back to the program because he was mad at Funk for that finish. Years earlier in St. Louis, Valentine in a television match beat up a young wrestler, pounding him so viciously that he was bleeding badly from the chest. When Dory Funk asked him if he needed to go that far, Valentine was very pragmatic. He said he had a main event coming up and had 3 television matches to make an impact before the show. If the show drew well because he made an impact, everyone would make more money. If the guy he wrestled got discouraged because of the beating, then he didn't belong in the business in the first place. Descriptions by wrestlers of that era, particularly the younger wrestlers who were starting their career when Valentine was one of the game's biggest stars, seem to indicate he had almost an Andy Kaufman-like eerie personality. "I'm not sure if what he did couldn't be done today, but it won't ever be done today," Terry Funk said about Valentine's slow-building style. "He was just real to everyone. He totally got everyone to suspend their disbelief in every match to a great extreme. Even in the dressing room, you didn't know if he was working or shooting. Nobody really knew. He had a high IQ. The important thing people didn't know about him was just how smart the guy was." Others, who traveled with him, echoed those comments. Flair remembered traveling with him early in his career, and Valentine would play classical music the entire trip and not even say a word, never breaking character in the car or in the dressing room. He hardly let on to the wrestlers, and the fans themselves never knew that he was, among other things, a master at chess. "I'd love to train a guy to wrestle that way," said Dory Funk, "but I wouldn't be doing him a favor because you couldn't get a promoter to go along with it. I don't think there will ever be anyone else that comes along that good in that style." He usually sat in a corner by himself with a blank stare, remembered Dory Funk, who wrestled Valentine numerous times when he was NWO World Champion between 1969 and 1973. The younger guys were afraid to talk to him. For those who would go up and talk with him, he was very much into what draws money, what the fans will buy, what works, and how to draw money working a program series of matches and rematches against the same opponent. Dory Funk remembered as champion, working 4 times with Valentine at the Sam Houston Coliseum in Houston. By this time Valentine had done the turn and was the territory's top babyface. And top babyface challenging the world champion was an easy program at first to draw, but they worked it so well that they sold out all 4 shows. His favorite finish was in the 3rd match, which went 70 minutes. Funk, as champion, had the match won when 60 minutes time limit expired. He said he didn't want to leave with a draw and asked for 10 more minutes. At the end of the period, Valentine was pounding on him and had him beat. When Valentine then asked for 10 more minutes because he didn't want to leave with a draw, Funk grabbed his belt and said, "I'll accept a draw," and left incredible heat, enough to bring it back a 4th time with a 90-minute time limit, and draw another sellout. Funk noted that because the time limit was 90 minutes, to give the fans what they expected, Valentine felt they couldn't do the blow-off finish until they passed the 60 minutes mark. Valentine and McDaniel are generally given credit for rebuilding Texas in 1969 after a down period and then building the Carolinas into one of the top territories in the country after it was long just another regional territory in 1974. The Texas territory had been built for years around Fritz Von Erich as the top star. Von Erich, who shortly after winning a nasty promotional war in Dallas and Fort Worth, stopped traveling the circuit to raise his family and run his 2 cities, leaving the rest of the cities without a major draw. The rest of the circuit suffered greatly as Von Erich was such a huge star and a great interview that he couldn't be replaced as the main man. It was Valentine as a heel and McDaniel as a babyface doing their stiff matches, which picked the rest of the territory up to where it was one of the hottest and most lucrative markets in the country, and it stayed that way with Valentine's babyface turn, tag team with McDaniel, and he'll turn again. The territory cooled down in the period after Valentine suffered his heart attack on March 15, 1973. At the time, Valentine was one of the top 5 stars in the business, at his drawing power peak, and working probably the toughest schedule of anyone in wrestling except for the NWO World Heavyweight Champion. He was the top babyface in St. Louis, at the time considered the wrestling capital of North America. He was the world champion, as a heel, for the Buffalo/Cleveland-based National Wrestling Federation run by Ignacio Martinez during what is still considered by many fans to this day the glory period of wrestling pre-WWF in that part of the country, with his feud with babyface Johnny Powers. He was still based in Texas, where he had made his heel turn and held the American heavyweight title, and was headlining Montreal as a heel, where he had just lost that area's version of the world heavyweight title to Jacques Rougeau Sr. He had 1 week earlier returned from a Japanese tour, where he was the leading star on tour. And he was 44 years old. The heart attack only kept him down for a few months, and he returned, working a program in Detroit with the Sheik, which meant short matches that would allow him to rebuild his stamina before getting back his NWF title from Rougeau. At that point, George Scott, booking for Crockett, talked him into coming to Charlotte full-time, a part of the country he had never appeared in. This was a huge risk at the time, for both men. Valentine was 45 years old by this point, and coming off a heart attack. While he was a superstar nearly everywhere, in those days you could remain a superstar for long periods of time because fans had longer memories after building your name. Valentine's style worked great in St. Louis, where they had a retro promotion doing an older style without gimmicks and where serious believability was important. And it worked in Texas, because the main eventers had to be considered tough guys, as it was a hard-hitting brawler's territory. He was an established main eventer and could work anywhere on top, particularly in the strong wrestling-oriented markets. But the Carolinas were different. It was a tag team territory, used to fast-paced matches and high spots, such as they were in 1974. Because of the heart attack, Valentine had gotten into the best shape of his career, and for the first time, watched his diet. But his style, he wouldn't do high spots because of their lack of realism, particularly since he was put in main events quickly, totally contradicted what had been done and what the fans had been educated to by the existing crew of main eventers and years of a more gimmick-oriented product. The thought by many was that you can't go back in time, and Valentine's style was okay for St. Louis, and he was a legend for decades in the places he was working, but his style wouldn't work in the Carolinas. Even worse, at first, fans were bored by Valentine's style and crowds dwindled. But Scott's patience and confidence was a virtue, as it turned out. Within a few months, business picked up to where it was good, and on occasion, very strong. Scott had been wrestling in Texas during one of the incarnations of the McDaniel program, which dated back to the 60s in Florida when Valentine was the toughest man in wrestling, and McDaniel, who was a star with the Miami Dolphins at the time, was a local football hero, where the established tough heel finally faced a babyface tough enough to stand up to him and give him back in kind. He brought in McDaniel, who at the time was one of the top babyface draws in the AWA. Soon the company, behind Valentine and McDaniel's long and brutal matches, was the hottest it had ever been. Valentine was still doing fly-ins in the big money cities like St. Louis and Houston during this period. Valentine's strength as a believable ultra-stiff heel setting up McDaniel's just as stiff comebacks, with both guys having the reputation as guys who were willing to take 5 of the other guys' best shots to get in one of their own, and not cover up, made him an incredibly hot babyface. Even after Valentine went down in the plane crash, the territory stayed strong as McDaniel as a face then made a new top heel that he had recommended to Scott that was working as a prelim jobber in the AWA before Scott started building him as a brash heel in the mold of Buddy Rogers. Just before the plane crash, Scott put the guy who was told to watch Rogers' tapes, Valentine's partner and rival from another era, together with Valentine as a tag team, in a feud with McDaniel which actually started before the crash to make him a single star. Valentine was paired off with Tim Mr. Wrestling Woods, Flair, the man in the seat behind Valentine in the plane crash that changed the course of wrestling history, after returning from a broken back, became the company's top singles star. Terry Funk compared Valentine with Lou Thesz as the two wrestlers, when he was breaking in during the 60s, who had the most presence both in the ring to the fans and out of the ring to the rest of the wrestlers. Even when they came into the dressing room, the wrestlers in the room were in awe of them. Suffice to say, he was still at his drawing peak nearly 2 years later in Charlotte, working a hot feud with former amateur great Woods, who he'd already done successful programs with, doing the toughest brawler versus classic scientific babyface in Georgia and Florida with. Woods, after the plane crash, because they were in a feud, had to publicly hide that he was in the same plane when it went down. He was actually rushed back into the ring well before his injuries had healed for that reason. Newspaper clips of the plane crash listed Tim Woods as George Wood in his real name and listed him as a wrestling promoter to keep fans from making the connection. His typical territorial MO was that he'd do his biggest business after the face turn, and they were a long way away from that. So there were clearly years left in him in that part of the country. If you knew you had Valentine coming in, you could build a territory around him and know that he was going to make you money, said Dory Funk. He was the best there ever was at selling a wrestling match that the people believed. He'd sell a headlock or an armlock for 15 minutes till the people bought it. Dory Funk remembered, if Valentine was a babyface when he was Subtle Hill champion, he could beat on him longer than anyone in the country, and as champion in that era he wrestled virtually every top star in the business that wasn't in the Minneapolis or New York territories, because fans had so much faith that Valentine would make a comeback, and when he did he would kick so much ass that it would be worth the wait. In Japan, where wrestling history is a big deal, Valentine's death was huge news. Valentine, always a headliner in that country, is generally credited as the man who made arguably the biggest wrestling star of this generation, Antonio Inoki. It was Valentine who put Inoki, at the time 23 years old, over in some famous matches in late 1966. Inoki had never having beaten a foreign superstar anywhere near that caliber before those matches. When Toyonobori, who was the biggest star of the established JWA after the death of Rikidozan, was fired by the other stockholders and Giant Baba was established as the new star, he formed a new promotion called Tokyo Pro Wrestling and got Inoki, then wrestling in Hawaii and being groomed to join Baba to be the new stars of the JWA group, to join him by offering him a power position. Inoki made a booking deal with Sonny Myers of Kansas City, and the big coup was bringing in Valentine, who was Inoki's favorite wrestler in the United States, and who had never been to Japan before, as United States champion, holding the Toronto version of the title, which he actually maintained for about 5 years in that part of the world. At the time, Inoki beat Valentine in 31:56 via count out on October 12, 1966 at Tokyo Sumo Hall, in the match generally credited with establishing Inoki as a superstar in Japan in one night. They met twice more on that tour, 60 minutes draw for the U.S. title on October 25, 1966, before Inoki won 2 out of 3 falls in their most famous meeting, taking the title in the main event of an Osaka baseball stadium show on November 19, 1966. After the promotion folded, the two kept their feud going in the old Iway promotion, put together by Hiro Matsuda and Isao Yoshihara, which was able to get bigger name foreigners due to Matsuda making a booking deal with Eddie Graham. Inoki and Matsuda had won a version of the World Tag Team titles in Memphis by this point in time, and went to a 60-minute draw on January 14, 1967 with Valentine and Graham before Inoki and Matsuda won a rematch 4 days later. On January 30, Inoki retained his U.S. title, beating Valentine again. Valentine appeared in late 1970 for JWP, with his most famous match coming on December 1, teaming with Gene Kiniski, losing 2 of 3 falls to Baba and Inoki for their International Tag Team title. Valentine was also Baba's final opponent in 1972 as International Heavyweight Champion before Baba quit JWP and formed All Japan Pro Wrestling later that year. He never worked for either All Japan or New Japan Pro Wrestling, and after the last Baba match didn't return to Japan until long after his career was over. Inoki's wins over Valentine had so much impact at the time, that even though TPW went out of business shortly after the match, when Inoki went back the next year to the established JWA, he was so established with the win that he was put in the position directly below Giant Baba as the top star in the company, and it led to the famous Baba and Inoki tag team era. This was one of the most successful box office periods in Japanese wrestling history, and Inoki became such a television ratings draw in that period that he's remained a cultural icon to this day. Long after the rest of the wrestling world had forgotten him, Inoki brought Valentine back for what was likely his final public appearance at a major pro wrestling show on September 30, 1990 at a Yokohama Arena show, when Inoki did his gimmick of the Greatest 18 Club, which were mainly composed of Inoki's greatest ring rivals, with the idea they had gotten together to create a championship that would represent what pro wrestling was and should be again, so to speak. While there were numerous famous wrestlers brought in for the show, including Luthez, Nick Bockwinkel, Tiger Jeet Singh, Johnny Powers, Inoki Billy Robinson, Willem Ruska, Hiro Matsuda, Stan Hansen and Andre the Giant, it was Valentine who stole the show. I only wrestled him once, in Houston, remembered Wayne Coleman, Billy Graham, of their match in 1975. But when I was in Minnesota, Wahoo would tell me war stories about him and Valentine in Texas. I had all those stories in my mind when I was booked to wrestle him. The first thing I did when I met him was I said, "Please go easy on me." He laughed. After all those stories, I froze in fear waiting for the first shot. I didn't want those blood blisters on my chest. He was a stiff guy, but he didn't hurt me. For whatever reason, Valentine did not have the same level of success in the Northeast that he had in most of the rest of the world, although he was a solid star and did headline Madison Square Garden on numerous occasions. He was also a frequent tag team champion with the likes of Dr. Jerry Graham, Buddy Rogers, Cowboy Bob Ellis and later Antonio Pugliese, Tony Parisi. In the early years, he feuded with the likes of the legendary tag teams of that era when tag teams actually were dominant in the territory, which really was the case before the Bruno Sammartino era, such as Mark Lewin and Don Curtis, the Bastian brothers, Red Bastian and Lou Klein, who wrestled as Lou Bastian, and the fabulous Kangaroos, Al Costello and Roy Heffernan. He showed up in Madison Square Garden for the first time during the Vince McMahon Sr./Toots Mondt era on June 14, 1958 with a high-card win over Luis Martinez, followed by a semifinal win over Lewin 1 month later. He remained in the undercards until going to a draw with Haystacks Calhoun underneath a sellout Argentina Rocca and Miguel Perez, father of the current IWA star, win over the Grahams on December 1, 1958. His first main event was March 9, 1959 before 19,990 fans teaming with Gene Stanley, and losing via DQ to Rocca and Perez in a match where the two split up in the third fall. They came back 2 weeks later, drawing 10,350 for a double feature with Valentine going to a no contest with Stanley underneath Rocca and Perez beating the Grahams. On May 23, 1959, Valentine and the Sheik lost via DQ to Rocca and Perez before losing cleanly in a 2 of 3 fall blow-off on June 20, 1959 before 12,000 fans. He got another main event on August 15, 1959 before 13,000 fans teaming with Eddie Graham to lose via DQ to Rocca and Perez, and on October 19, 1959, worked to the semifinal teaming with Jerry Graham to beat Lewin and Curtis. On November 13, 1959, before a sellout of 21,890 fans underneath a Rocca vs. Amazing Zuma main event, Valentine and Jerry Graham went to a no contest with Calhoun and Bearcat Wright. This led to the December 7, 1959 main event with Rocca and Wright going to a 30-minute draw with Valentine and Jerry Graham before 12,751 fans. He was gone for several months, returning on March 7, 1960 teaming with Eddie Graham to go to a no contest with Rocca and Perez before 8,912 fans in the main event, and then left the area. He returned on December 23, 1960 in the main event as a babyface, teaming with Rocca going to a no contest with the Kangaroos before 11,612 fans. The rematch on January 23, 1961, which Rocca and Valentine won via DQ in 36:08 drew 14,783. Valentine and Argentina Apollo, who was brought in as the substitute for Rocca when the promotion and Rocca had their falling out. And they did such a good job of getting Apollo's MSG debut over, that they sold out to the tune of 20,400 going to a draw after 42-32 against the Kangaroos. Valentine and Apollo drew another sellout of 20,702 on May 26, 1951 going to a curfew draw with Buddy Rogers and Bob Orton Sr. Rogers vs. Valentine in a singles main event on July 28, 1961, which Rogers won. Drew 17,698. Rogers and Orton then beat Rocca, who had returned, and Valentine on August 25, 1961, before 18,752 fans. With Rocca back on top, Valentine and Apollo worked semifinals against the Kangaroos in Togo and Sato before December 11, 1961 when Rocca and Valentine beat the Kangaroos before 13,430 fans, followed by a January 22, 1962 sellout with Valentine and Wright losing to Rogers and Orton before 20,777. On February 26, 1962, Valentine and Ellis beating Rogers and Orton via count out before 19,633. Rocca and Valentine beat Skull Murphy and Brute Bernard the next month before 18,777. Rogers and Johnny Barnes beat Valentine and Ellis on July 13, 1962 before 14,352 fans. Valentine beat Giant Baba in an undercard match on August 3, 1962 and he was gone from the territory. He returned to MSG on August 2, 1965 going to a draw with Waldo Von Erich and followed with 2 draws with Big Bill Miller, leading to November 15, 1965 when Bill and Dan Miller beat Valentine and Bruno Sammartino at 32-58 before 13,913 fans. Sammartino and Valentine won the rematch on December 13, 1965 before 10,090 fans. Valentine then worked semifinals against the Miller brothers underneath Sammartino's title defenses, with partners like Bobo Brazil and Pugliese in early 1966 before again leaving the territory. The reason he never had a Madison Square Garden program against Sammartino for the WWF title appears more a timing issue than anything else. After Valentine turned on Pugliese, who was billed as Sammartino's cousin and often the stepping stone where heels would attack Pugliese to build to Sammartino defending family and Italian honor, he left for Texas where was having a strong run as the top heel in the hot territory feuding with Fritz Von Erich. He was flown back only to work a program in major cities like Pittsburgh and Baltimore for the title against Sammartino in the summer of 1966. MSG was closed that summer and by the time it was reopened, he was working in Japan. He had been off television in the Northeast too long by the time he returned from Japan, so the heat had run its course. He clearly had his dark and strange side, like Kaufman. He was known as the king of ribs, but his ribs weren't always harmless pranks as the word would lend one to believe, such as taking scissors and cutting up people's clothes while they were in the ring or doing strange things to arena rats while on the road. Many people in wrestling detested him. Far more were just scared of him, and others didn't like to work with him because he was too physically tough to work with because of the extremes he would go to make matches seem real. He could be cruel and sadistic outside the ring, and because he didn't break character among most of the wrestlers, so they didn't know how to take him. He thought the wrestling business wasn't for anyone but guys who were physically and mentally tough, and he tested out the newcomers. The crueler pranks often involved feces, whether on people's clothes or even while they were in the bathroom at a restaurant, would sneak it in their food. There had been several times over the past years when the doctors had given up on Valentine. His real name was John Theodore Wisniski, not John Anthony as reported here last week, and told his wife, Sharon, that it was over. His condition had worsened since August, when he broke his back again in a fall. He pulled through every time, but with problems with hospitals and medical bills piling up, his last years were not good. It must have been hell for a man who prided himself on his toughness and his performance ability to be confined to a wheelchair for the profession that he felt a certain way about, not only forgotten but changed completely from his belief as to what it should be. Johnny Valentine. Career Title History. Source: Wrestling Title History's 3rd edition. Note: this can at best be considered only a partial list as complete records aren't available before the 70s. National Wrestling Federation World Heavyweight, Buffalo/Cleveland area, later became New Japan's world title, defeated Abdullah the Butcher October 19, 1972 Cleveland, vacated title due to suffering heart attack March 1973, defeated Jacques Rougeau Sr. August 1973, lost to Johnny Powers 1973 Rochester, New York. IWA World Heavyweight, Eastern Canada, defeated Jacques Rougeau Sr. October 1972, lost to Jacques Rougeau Sr. January 1973. NWA Missouri State Heavyweight, defeated Harley Race January 19, 1973 St. Louis, lost to Terry Funk February 2, 1973 St. Louis. NWA United National, defeated Seiji Sakaguchi March 2, 1973 Yokohama, lost to Akihisa Takachiho, Great Kabuki, March 8, 1973 Sano. NWA United States Heavyweight Carolina's version, defeated Harley Race July 3, 1975 Greensboro, title vacated October 4, 1975 when Valentine had to retire due to injuries suffered in airplane crash. NWA United States Heavyweight, Michigan/Ohio version, defeated Fritz Von Erich June 13, 1964 Detroit, lost to the Sheik February 6, 1965 Detroit, defeated the Sheik July 7, 1973 Detroit, lost to the Sheik July 21, 1973 Detroit, defeated the Sheik 1973, lost to the Sheik September 1973. NWA American Heavyweight Texas, defeated Fritz Von Erich June 9, 1966, lost to Fritz Von Erich August 4, 1966, defeated Fritz Von Erich May 2, 1969, lost to Fritz Von Erich August 4, 1969 Fort Worth, defeated Billy Red Lyons July 8, 1972 Corpus Christi, title vacated March 1973 when Valentine suffers heart attack. NWA United States Heavyweight Canada version, won title 1962, lost to Bruno Sammartino November 22, 1962 Toronto, defeated Bruno Sammartino December 14, 1962 Toronto, lost to the Beast October 17, 1963 Toronto, defeated the Beast November 1963, lost to Tiger Jeet Singh May 1968 Toronto. TPW United States Heavyweight Japan version, first champion, lost to Antonio Inoki November 19, 1966 Osaka. NWA Mid-Atlantic Heavyweight, won tournament February 1974 when champ Jerry Briscoe left territory, vacated title when winning U.S. title which supplanted this title as the main singles title in territory. NWA Southern Heavyweight defeated Danny Dusek July 17, 1950 Tampa, lost to Danny Dusek August 7, 1950 Tampa, defeated Ron Fuller June 6, 1973 Tampa, lost to Bill Dromo August 1973. NWA Texas Heavyweight, defeated Ed Francis August 1954, lost to the Sheik October 1954, defeated Bill Melby January 21, 1958 Dallas, lost to El Medico. Luis Hernandez, March 28, 1958 Houston, defeated Dan Miller February 28, 1969 Houston, lost to Jose Lothario June 7, 1969 San Antonio, defeated Jose Lothario August 20, 1969 San Antonio, lost to Wahoo McDaniel October 1969 Corpus Christi, defeated Wahoo McDaniel October 29, 1969 Austin, lost to Wahoo McDaniel January 26, 1970 Fort Worth, defeated Wahoo McDaniel April 1970, lost to George Scott October 13, 1970 Dallas, defeated George Scott November 1970, lost to Tim Mr. Wrestling Woods November 11, 1970, defeated Tim Mr. Wrestling Woods 1971, lost to Pepper Gomez February 18, 1971 Corpus Christi, defeated Pepper Gomez March 1971, lost to Jose Lothario November 17, 1971 San Antonio. NWA Florida Heavyweight defeated Boris Malenko August 26, 1967 Tampa, lost to Joe Scarpa. Chief J. Strongbow, December 5, 1967 Tampa, defeated Joe Scarpa December 27, 1967 Tampa, lost to Red Bastion April 30, 1967 Tampa, defeated Red Bastion July 27, 1968 Tampa, lost to Nick Kozak September 23, 1968 Orlando. NWA Georgia Heavyweight defeated Mr. Wrestling Tim Woods, May 10, 1968 Atlanta, lost to Tarzan Tyler June 14, 1968 Atlanta, defeated Masked Professional Doug Gilbert, August 23, 1968 Atlanta, lost to Masked Professional December 6, 1968 Atlanta. NWA Canadian Heavyweight defeated George Gordienko January 1959 Edmonton, lost to John Foley July 1959 Edmonton. NWA United States Tag Team, Northeast version which later became WWF US Tag Team, with Jerry Graham defeated Mark Lewin and Don Curtis November 14, 1959 West Hempstead, New York, vacated title when Eddie Graham returned and became Jerry's partner, with Buddy Rogers defeated Fabulous Kangaroos Al Costello and Roy Heffernan November 19, 1960 Teaneck, New Jersey, with Chief Big Heart lost to Kangaroos November 26, 1960 in Washington, D.C. when Rogers turned on Valentine, with Cowboy Bob Ellis defeated Kangaroos January 11, 1962 in Washington, D.C., lost to Buddy Rogers and Johnny Barnes July 5, 1962 Washington, D.C. WWF United States Tag Team, with Antonio Pugliese, Tony Parisi, defeated Bill and Dan Miller February 21, 1966 New York, lost to Smasher Sloan and Baron Mikkel Shikluna September 24, 1966 in Washington, D.C., when Valentine turned heel on Pugliese. NWA World Tag Team, Midwest version which later became AWA World Tag Team titles, with Chet Wallach, as the Atomic Blondes, defeated Joe and Guy Bernetti December 10, 1957 Minneapolis, lost to Vern Gagne and Bronco Nagurski December 26, 1957 Minneapolis. NWA International Tag Team, with Killer Karl Krupp defeated Kentaro Oki and Seiji Sakaguchi December 2, 1972 Tokyo, lost to Kentaro Oki and Umanosuke Ueda March 6, 1973 Nagoya. NWA American Tag Team, with Wahoo McDaniel defeated Bronco Lubick and Chris Markoff 1971, lost to Bronco Lubick and Chris Markoff 1971, with Wahoo McDaniel defeated Bronco Lubick and Chris Markoff 1971, lost to Thunderbolt Patterson and Toru Tanaka July 19, 1971 Fort Worth, Tanaka and Patterson split up and Patterson picked Valentine as partner, lost to Fritz Von Erich and Dean Ho January 25, 1972 Dallas. NWF North American Heavyweight defeated Johnny Powers 1972, lost to Johnny Powers November 23, 1972 Cleveland. NWA Southern Tag Team, with Boris Malenko defeated Jose Lothario and Joe Scarpa August 6, 1968 Tampa, lost to Jose Lothario and Joe Scarpa August 31, 1968 Tampa. NWA Texas Tag Team, with Rip Rogers, Eddie Graham, defeated Enrique and Alberto Torres April 22, 1958 Dallas, lost to Pepper Gomez and Larry Shen May 23, 1958 Houston. Florida Brass Knucks Champ, defeated Mike DiBiase April 23, 1968 Tampa, lost to Eddie Graham June 10, 1968 Orlando. Texas Brass Knucks Champ, defeated Joe Christie 1954, lost to Joe Christie October 15, 1954 Houston, defeated Killer Kowalski July 1971, lost to Jose Lothario February 1973. United States Television defeated Vern Gagne 1958 Chicago, lost to Doug Joyce April 1958, defeated Doug Joyce April 8, 1958, title dropped. International Wrestling Alliance World Heavyweight, Chicago after Fred Kohler left NWA, defeated Yukon Moose Kalak July 12, 1962 Chicago, vacated title leaving territory. International TV, California, Defeated Nick Bockwinkel November 1955. Lost to Nick Bockwinkel December 1955. International Tag Team, Toronto with Bulldog Brower defeated Bruno Sammartino and Whipper Billy Watson February 28, 1963 Toronto. Lost to Sailor Art Thomas and John Paul Henning July 25, 1963 Toronto. With the Beast defeated Sailor Art Thomas and John Paul Henning August 1963. Lost to Sailor Art Thomas and John Paul Henning September 19, 1963 Toronto. With Jim Hottie defeated Jerry Graham and Bulldog Brower December 5, 1963 Toronto. Titles vacated. Wrestling Observer Hall of Fame, 1996. The WWF Backlash pay-per-view on April 29 at the Allstate Arena in Chicago was hardly meant as a tribute to Johnny Valentine. Sadly enough, the name was never even mentioned on any WWF telecasts or the pay-per-view. But in a weird way, with the long matches and by-the-book style of booking, much of the show felt like a throwback to 70s psychology but with more modern moves. With a weaker main event going in than most WWF pay-per-view events, combined with coming off such a spectacular series of big shows, culminating in WrestleMania, there was bound to be a letdown factor. Judged against the last 4 WWF pay-per-view shows, this wasn't anywhere close. The matches that on paper looked to be the best were disappointments for different reasons. But nothing was really bad, except perhaps the Duchess of Queensberry stuff, which was too reminiscent of the Canadian Rules match last summer with Mike Awesome vs. Lance Storm on the WCW pay-per-view in Vancouver, BC with Jacques Rougeau as referee. While a lot of people brought up copying a concept that was disastrous when it was first used, it also was the concept Vince McMahon used himself with the rule changes throughout the match, which heel promoters on indie shows have copied to death since, that was successful. Problem was it was predictable, sort of a clown show, and the contradiction between that match and Kurt Angle vs. Chris Benoit which followed, which could only work if people were taking it seriously, was a negative. While Angle vs. Benoit got the majority of votes for best match, there was something missing. The match played much better on television than it did live, and that was because of the commentary. Bottom line is that as great mat wrestlers as both men proved to be, this was too long and it was too much of a handicap to eliminate near falls. This was a match that would have played much better during the 70s in the United States. But even then they had the 2 counts to play with, or in Japan, where the submission moves are more over. The crossface and ankle lock spots got the crowd to react, but moves like armbars and knee locks haven't been pro wrestling submission moves on WWF TV and the crowd wasn't educated to them. Without the ability to use gimmicks, do near falls and break tables, 30 minutes was too long for the live crowd. The most falls concept also worked against the match, because fans still see that top guys don't tap out, and these guys both did 3 and 4 times in one night. I don't think anyone would argue that neither man really got over, regardless of technical skill, and who won or lost. Main event was just an elongated Raw match. Again, it was nearly 30 minutes, which was too long on a show where you already had one match go that length. It was roughly as good as everyone expected. A good match, but WWF has set expectations so high because of Triple H, Rock, Angle and Austin's string of main events that this couldn't compete with the standard. It was probably Undertaker's best performance in a long time, however. Show drew a sellout 15,592 fans, which was 14,751 paying $831,510 with another $143,908 in merchandise sales. It was billed as the 18th sellout in a row in Chicago on the broadcast. Actually it was the 17th in the last 18 as one show came very close, and the sellout streak was so impressive they decided to just continue the streak because, well, this is pro wrestling and you do those things. Hey, at least it wasn't the XFL where they announced sellouts with totally empty upper decks. Jerry Lynn made his TV debut on Heat, winning the light heavyweight title from Crash Holly, Mike Lockwood, in 3:37. Paul Heyman, when talking about Lynn, mentioned his matches in the past with X-Pac, Global Wrestling late 1991, and Rob Van Dam. Aside from a loud ECW chant, crowd was quiet. They were a little off on some stuff, but the finish was well done and fans applauded the good wrestling. Lynn won after a schoolboy holding the tights. Belita, Amy Dumas, pinned Molly Holly, Nora Greenwald, in 2:40 after a moonsault. Some good acrobatics, but the two were rough working with each other. Lita won with a twist of fate and a moonsault, where she slipped slightly, acknowledged in commentary, and landed sort on Holly's knees. This is clearly building toward Lita as a face challenging a heel Chyna in a title program. I sense a major phase down for Chyna. 1. X Factor, Sean Waltman and Matt Bloom and Pete Polacco beat Dudley's, Mark LaMonica and Devin Hughes and Matt Hyson, and 7:59. Basic by the book match. Heat on Devon most of the way. Hot tag to Bubba, new spelling, who told Devon to get the table. Albert laid out Devon with a high kick and then later squashed Bubba in the corner, and Credible and X-Pac gave him a double super kick for the finish. Dudleys did their usual post-match with Devon crotching Albert, Spike doing the acid drop, I think they called it the Dudley Dong, on Credible, and then a 3D on X-Pac through a table ended this. 2 stars. 2. Rhino Terry Guerin retained the hardcore title, pinning Raven Scott Levy in 8-10. This would be the only match on the show that exceeded expectations and may have been the best bout on the show. A lot of creative spots put in. Rhino ran up the ring steps to kill Raven on a chair, but he moved and Rhino crashed into the chair. Raven ran off the steps and nailed Rhino. Started hitting each other a lot with garbage cans and street signs. A shopping cart came in which saw a bunch of 10 items or less jokes and commentary. Raven did the drop toe hold and Rhino's face went into a shopping cart. They killed each other with hard shots with signs to the head. That can't be good for you in later life. Maybe every wrestler who lets themselves be pounded on for the sake of art at 30 should meet some guy like Floyd Patterson or Joe Frazier to see what potential long-term can come from this. Good near falls. Rhino gored a shopping cart and went right through the open. Raven pummeled the shopping cart with a kitchen sink and Rhino was nearly pinned, but finally came back with his gore for the finish. 3 1/4 stars. 3. William Regal Darren Matthews pinned Chris Jericho Chris Irvine in 12-11 in what was billed as a Duchess of Queensberry match, complete with a matronly-looking woman dressed as a duchess at ringside playing a cross between Vince McMahon and Jacques Rougeau and doing a gimmick of changing the rules as they went along. Match was fine as far as work, but got silly in a hurry. Jericho had Regal pinned after the Lionsault when the Duchess signaled for the bell, claiming it was the end of the first round. Regal gave Jericho a weird-looking German suplex on his head. He used the Regal stretch, but Jericho made the ropes. Then when Jericho got on the walls, Regal tapped, but it was announced that submissions aren't allowed under the rules. Regal then hit Jericho over the head with the Duchess scepter and was DQ'd. Of course, it was then ruled that there is no DQ under the rule and the match continued. Regal finally ended up with his face in the Duchess' crotch and did his priceless facials. Jericho threw her into the ring and put her in the walls, and Regal nailed Jericho with 3 chair shots and got the pin. From an idea standpoint, this was as bad as the Vancouver match from last year, but didn't come across quite as bad. Still, the idea of trying to directly follow this with a match requiring suspension of disbelief was very strange. 1 star. 4. Chris Benoit beat Kurt Angle in an Iron Man submission match in 31-31. Of course, the mat work was very good. Even in Japan in work shoots where a lot of mat work is done and they don't do pinfalls or near falls such as Rings Works style, which doesn't really exist anymore anyway, they always balanced it out by allowing knockouts, which stiff blows were used to counter the mat work and set up working for the submission in building. Even the best submission guys in Japan need the hard striking to set it up to make it work, and only the best go 30 minutes to an educated crowd. They also did 30-second rest periods, which was longer than in last year's Triple H vs. Rock's 60 minutes match, which had far more leeway in what the guys could do with usage of near falls, using objects and breaking furniture so they didn't have to give fans moves that fans hadn't been educated toward. Benoit did the crossface outside the ring and Angle tapped, but it didn't count. Paul Heyman explained that in the Olympics if someone did a submission and they rolled off the mats, it wouldn't count. Angle won the first fall at 6:34 with a knee lock. Move wasn't over since it's never been used as a finisher before. Heyman did a good job in explaining that taps would be quicker in this match. He didn't quite say because the match continues and you have to go 30, it's suicide to avoid tapping because you'll be a dead duck the rest of the match with an injured joint, but explained the psychology of it. Benoit won the second fall in 8:03 with an armbar. That move wasn't over either for the same reason. Benoit started working the shoulder, doing another armbar leading to a rope break, the old shoulder breaker out of the 70s. Benoit threw down the ref, allowing Angle to use a chair shot and put on the ankle lock at 10:19. Angle then went up 3-1 using Benoit's own crossface on him at 11:05. Noticeable cheers for Angle live at this point since he beat Benoit with his own move. Benoit backdropped Angle over the top rope and posted him, then used the ankle lock on the floor, but it didn't count. Benoit again went to the armbar, which still wasn't over. Did a sharpshooter, which was over, for a rope break before using a half crab for the submission at 18:02. Ahead 3-2, Angle started stalling. With no clock and scoreboard, the live fans didn't seem to get the story they were telling about logical stalling and riding the clock. Ross, with his sports background, did a very good job of getting that across to the TV viewers, which is why it played so much better on TV. I think the very first suplex of the match didn't come until 26:40 by Angle, who did a few. Benoit did the rolling German. Angle came back with an ankle lock that would put the match out of reach, but Benoit reversed it and did the move himself for the submission, tying it up at 27:50. That story didn't get across well live. After the rest period, they had 1:40 left. Benoit did a German suplex, but Angle did a low blow and ankle lock, but a rope break. Another ankle lock and another rope break. Angle did a back suplex into another ankle lock and Benoit gutted it out until time expired, then right after the bell tapped out, which pretty well guaranteed he was winning. They ordered a sudden death overtime, and Benoit got the crossface in 1:31 to win. 3 1/4 stars. 5. Shane McMahon beat Big Show Paul White in 11:53 in a last man standing match. This isn't the easiest match to do. There was nothing terrible about it, but aside from the bump, nothing much good either. McMahon did 3 real hard chair shots to the head. They did the old ether on a towel gimmick by Shane to put Show down, but he didn't stay down for 10. That's from the Cornette playbook. Vince hit Shane with a chair and Show gave Shane the final cut. Jack Doan gave a really slow count and Show picked him up at 8. Well, he's losing for sure. Choke slam and again Show picked him up at 8. Show put Shane in the torture rack when Test ran in as the designated WCW savior, which is kind of scary in itself, with his dreaded high kick. Show threw Test over the top and beat him up as well. They ended up all fighting to the entrance area. Shane climbed the beanstalk, which was actually the Backlash setup. Show went to climb, but Test pulled Show down. Test started killing Show with a sign. Shane got up to the top, which looked to be 29 feet high, and I guess came down with an elbow on a crash pad. Shane sold the blow as well, as Test had to pick him up and drag him over a pipe, which he collapsed on, to beat the count while Show didn't. They showed a million replays, and that took a ton of guts to look down and jump, but the replays also showed Shane never came close to hitting Show. 1 1/2 stars. 6. Matt Hardy retained the European title in a 3-way over Christian, Jey Uso and Eddie Guerrero in 6:52. No heat but very smooth, good wrestling. A few near falls. Edge came out and speared Matt. I was expecting Saturn to come out, but maybe because of his arm injury, they decided against it. Jeff came out as well. Christian did the unprettier on Guerrero and then Jeff did a swanton behind the ref's back, which actually totally missed Christian, leading to Matt using the twist of fate on Christian for the pin. 2 3/4 stars. 7. Steve Austin, Steve Williams, and Triple H Paul Levesque beat Undertaker, Mark Calloway, and Glenn Jacobs in 27-11 to win the tag titles in a match where Austin's WWF title and Triple H's IC belt were also at stake. Thus Triple H joins Shawn Michaels as the only wrestler to hold the WWF, IC, European and tag titles. Tried to tell a story with Kane having an arm injury and Taker trying to protect him from his own guts. Undertaker took the punishment and wouldn't tag out. Worked on his knees but he wouldn't tag. It was scary how badly the fans were wanting to cheer Austin. Early in the match, he went to one corner and you could see everyone in the building on that side cheering. He smartly he did it to the other corners, teasing a second, and then not doing it as a heel move. Kane tagged himself in and they bumped for him as he did the one-arm gimmick. He gave Austin a clothesline off the top and slammed Triple H off the top. Austin and Triple H started working on Kane's elbow after the old divorce court move. Austin hit the arm with a chair. Undertaker somewhere got his cuts from last month opened hard way again. At this point, something happened with Austin and Kane, as you could tell there was a major communication problem. Kane went for a clothesline, Austin was out of position and not expecting it. Austin went for a back suplex and Kane wasn't ready and didn't jump for it. They had some trouble later. Triple H did the pedigree on Kane, but instead of going for the pin, which would necessitate a kick out, he tagged Austin. Saying Triple H is so clever is not a knock, it's praise, and he is. It is a knock that sometimes what is good for him isn't good for the company, and we've seen with Hogan and Nash the end result of that. Clever stuff like him tagging out doesn't hurt anyone. Taker chokeslammed Austin but Stephanie distracted ref Earl Hebner. Hebner shoved Stephanie off the apron. Kane did an enzui-jiri but Triple H crashed into Hebner. Hebner missed the hot tag to Undertaker, who gave Triple H the last ride but Hebner wouldn't count, thinking he wasn't the legal man. Another ref bump. Austin did the stunner on Kane but no ref. Stephanie gave Triple H a belt to use, but Kane used a high kick on him and then her. This set up Vince's run-in with a sledgehammer. Kane went after Vince, but with the cameras missing a finishing sequence again, and how in the WCW does this happen? Triple H hit Kane with a sledgehammer to the head and scored the pin. 3 stars. Jim Ross has spent the past 2 weeks with meetings in Atlanta and Los Angeles putting together the talent end of the new WCW organization, which is tentatively being targeted for a June 13th relaunch taping for air date on June 16th. At press time, those dates were tentative because negotiations with TNN hadn't been finalized by Stuart Snyder of WWFE. Sources at TNN have confirmed June 16th as the current planned startup date, with the station bumping Grand Ole Opry to make room for WCW. Ross met with Rob Sotkowski, Rob Van Dam, his wife, and agent Michael Meltzer for the first time on April 25th, and in his Ross report described the meetings as very positive. There was a major roadblock dating back to the few shows Sotkowski worked for WWF while being part of ECW, including refusing to do a job at a television taping. Sotkowski and Terry Brunk, Sabu, ended their WWF relationship on a bad note with Vince McMahon, but that was also several years ago. Ross had one phone conversation with Meltzer several months back, and it appeared there was no interest in him. The reality that the new WCW product would be short of potential headliners, particularly at first, plus the fact Ross had been wanting to meet with him for some time, led to the meeting. No decision has been made if a deal were to be made whether he would be placed in the WWF or WCW camp, but just because WCW would be short at first on headliners, one would think he'd be placed there. The feeling was that the meeting went well, but no money or contract offer was made by Ross. There was also a meeting with Brad Small, the agent who represents Booker Huffman, T. Paige Falkenberg, John Laurinaitis, Johnny Ace, Pete Gruner, Billy Kidman, and Chris Klusaritis, Chris Kanyon. Each of the aforementioned people have different issues. Klusaritis' contract with Time Warner expired last week, so he's basically a lock to go in. Ross has made it clear to virtually everyone he's negotiated with that the salaries offered will not be in the league of what they were used to earning, but there is potential to earn more if the new company is successful. Many involved with meetings with Ross have noted that he's not tried to snow them with the idea they'd be making more, and brings up potential negatives, and most felt they were being dealt with more honestly than typical wrestling negotiations. Huffman has a $750,000 deal and more than 1 year, one source close to the situation says nearly 2 years, remaining on it, so he's walking away from potentially a lot of money, but has made it seemingly clear he wants to be part of the new group, since the belief is going in the big three would be him, Falkenberg, and Scott Reich-Steiner. At this point, WWF has for all real purposes given up on pursuing Bill Goldberg, because they've decided against making him an offer anywhere in the ballpark of what he's making to not wrestle, with him having in excess of $6 million left for the nearly 3 years remaining on his Time Warner contract. Falkenberg has about 9 months left on his contract, which guarantees him well in excess of $1 million, but is also anxious to work for WWF, even though he wouldn't be getting an offer anywhere in that ballpark. How anxious and how much money he's willing to give up is a decision he hasn't made yet. Those close to the situation believe the odds are better than 50% that neither Falkenberg nor Reich-Steiner would be available for the relaunch, but that both would come in at some point down the line. While no deal with Huffman is made, nor has he gotten a release from Time Warner, the belief is he's more likely than not going to be signed by the time the division is relaunched. Gruner also has more than 1 year remaining on a $300,000 per year deal, and has no 90-day cycles. So for him to come in immediately would mean he'd be passing up a lot of guaranteed money. Most see Time Warner as dragging its feet on offering buyouts, even though the result is they are paying a lot of huge salaries. Besides the names listed, also people like Kevin Nash, Jeff Jarrett, Lex Luger, and Ric Flair, while not operating a company that is bringing in any income. Laurinaitis, ironically, has more options than most, but probably not as an active wrestler, due to his smooth maneuverings as a politician. He has a guaranteed contract for 2 more years with Time Warner, and as an office employee and not talent, he doesn't have to get a release, so can likely double dip, still get his Time Warner paycheck while also being paid from another company, either with WWF or a potential offer as the Hulk Hogan Universal deal goes through. Flair has expressed interest in joining the new company and has spoken with Ross about it, but with 2 years left guaranteed at a high dollar amount, his situation is unchanged. No contracts have been offered at this point to any talent, so there is no real barometer of what kind of money will be offered, other than the most recent WWF signees like Terry Guerin, Jerry Lynn, and Yoshihiro Tajiri came in at about the $100,000 level as far as a downside is concerned, and Matt Hyson came in well under that figure. Those working on the road on the WWF would earn more because they are paid on a percentage of the house, and the WWF side houses are usually very good and they do 18 to 20 house shows per month plus a lucrative pay-per-view event. The WCW side eventually wants to build to a Wednesday through Saturday night schedule and monthly pay-per-view events, but at the beginning it would be only one show on a Wednesday, so at least at first, nobody would be likely to make more than their downside. Ross also met on that day with Rick Cornell Reno, Chavo Guerrero Jr., Chuck Palumbo and Sean O'Hare. He later went to the UPW show that evening and seemed to show the most interest in Nathan Jones, John Heidenreich, and Josh Wilcox, who was the member of the XFL's Los Angeles Extreme who did the elbow drop on the football after scoring the first touchdown in the $1 Million Game. Ross wrote in his report that Wilcox could be used in WCW right away. There is talk of attempting to use him as a cross-marketing deal with WCW and XFL if there is an XFL next season. About half the XFL players have asked to be released from their contracts to negotiate with NFL teams, and many have been signed, but Wilcox, who played last season for the New Orleans Saints, feels because of his number of years in and being a fringe player, that the NFLPA minimum salary and salary caps would make it impossible to make an NFL team and has committed to staying in the XFL if it's still around. Wilcox's mic work at the UPW show was surprisingly good, and it had to be, since he was doing an angle with Adam Pearce, who is a hell of a talker and should be considered for at worst, a Bobby Heenan-like manager part-time wrestler role, if not as a wrestler because one of the weaknesses in the current crew is the lack of strong interviewers. The timetable seems to be to put together a full roster in about 2 weeks. The non-wrestling crew, such as road agents, referees, front office, announcers, etc. will probably be finalized a few weeks after that. The plan with Wednesday tapings is to tape in smaller-sized arenas, 4,000 to 7,500 seats, in the same geographical location of the WWF SmackDown tapings the night before, since they will use the same production crew and production truck. As mentioned last week, there are both advantages and disadvantages, none mysterious, over taping on Wednesday, easier on the crew, more time to edit out mistakes, as opposed to Saturday, lower cost to fly in talent, more immediacy, easier to sell tickets to the events. All of the former WCW performers who had 90-day cycles in their contracts were finally informed this past week the inevitable that they will be cycled out, which means most will become free agents in July. Probably the biggest name on that list that WWF has some interest in is Oscar Gutierrez, Rey Mysterio Jr., but there have been no talks with him thus far. The ones WWF doesn't pick up will probably become regulars on the indie circuit or hook up with one of the numerous startups that are expected, probably be in demand for foreign stars as Dave Penzer has been trying to round people up for European tours, as well as some will have shots in Japan. The Ross report officially listed the 24 wrestlers the company already has signed: Mike Alfonso, Awesome, Bill DeMott, Hugh Morris, Lance Evers, Storm, Chavo Guerrero Jr., Sean Stepich, Tasiak, John Hugger, Johnny the Bull, Shane Helms, Shannon Moore, Evan Kavagias, Courageous Palumbo O'Hare, Mike Sanders, Mark Jindrak, Elix Skipper, Alan Funk Kiwi, Mark LaRue, Lash, Jerry Toot, Wall, Kaz Hayashi, James Howard, Tammy Noble, James Yun Yang, Stacy Keebler, Cornell, Reno, Sam Roman, Kid Romeo, and Jason Broyles, Jason Jett aka Easy Money. All are expected to be cycled out of their current contracts and most, if not all, offered new contracts under WWF terms after the new WCW begins and the new ownership can evaluate them. It is believed the main names being considered as far as announcers are Scott Hudson, Mike Tenay, Joey Styles, Mark Madden, and Jerry Lawler. Lawler is at best a very long shot because at this point Vince McMahon doesn't want him and there are obstacles to work through because it is believed he won't come back without his wife and McMahon likely won't budge on that issue. There is a feeling he'd be the best man for the job and there is a natural storyline of him going with Shane and hating Vince since the story of his departure has gotten some mainstream publicity. The company is looking at a lot of resumes and storyline ideas submitted by people applying for writing jobs, which should be filled within the next few weeks. The writing team from WCW will be separate from WWF, but the two teams will work together on Mondays and Tuesdays to make sure angles don't conflict, such as both groups, for example, building up to cage matches on television or on pay-per-view during the same week, or angles being repeated too closely with different characters on both shows. A further examination of the ECW Chapter 11 bankruptcy petition filed 3 weeks ago puts an apparent realistic positioning of where ECW fits into the real pro wrestling landscape in North America over the past 2 years. In 1999, according to the petition, it claimed ECW grossed $5,822,312 in total income. During the same period, WWF grossed more than $259 million and WCW grossed more than $160 million, losing about $16 million in the process. In 2000, ECW claimed it grossed $4,124,452, losing about $2.5 million for the year, as compared to about $379 million by the WWF and $120 million by WCW, losing about $65 million for the year, giving ECW less than a 1% market share of a roughly $500 million Major League Pro Wrestling industry. WWF, New Japan and WCW, as well as Pride, have had numerous single events that took in more revenue than ECW did over the course of the year 2000. ECW's income declined drastically in 2000, although not as drastically as WCW's. But nor should it have, because ECW did nothing overt, as opposed to nearly everything overt, to run its audience off. But it is interesting to note how income fell significantly during a year when the company had national television coverage for 9 months in prime time, something they never had before. It shows the value of national television, at least for a cult promotion like ECW, was in the long run highly overrated in exposing its product to a new audience and helping its various revenue streams. It also showed that pay-per-view buy rates must have dropped drastically over that year. If the company had generated no money on advertising, and it didn't generate much, no money on licensing, which it did, no money on house shows or merchandising, which it clearly generated a very significant amount, to gross that much money it could not have averaged above 0.15 buy rates for the year theoretically. There is significant amounts of money claimed to be owed by and demand that could change that figure somewhat. Since the other sources did generate significant money, that would indicate a much lower figure. ECW was owned 85% by Paul Heyman and 15% by Anondius Incorporated, a division of Acclaim. It was faced with numerous lawsuits from around the country for non-payment of bills, and left tons of unpaid bills not involving at least existing lawsuits in its wake. A listing of all debtors, according to the petition filed by Heyman, shows wrestling talent, television stations' time was purchased on, radio stations' advertising was taken out on, Heyman's family, numerous business partners and associates, lawyers, travel agencies, credit card companies, loan companies, J-Mar, which produces championship belts, and numerous others. In addition, the lack of comprehensive bookkeeping seems evident. Tommy Dreamer even stated on Wrestling Observer Live that in last-ditch efforts to raise funding to keep the company going, they failed to come to fruition because they couldn't provide the companies any sort of verifiable bookkeeping records. So many people owed money were listed in round numbers indicating estimates as opposed to well-kept records. Others still, including many wrestlers, were listed as being owed money, but the figure was listed as unknown. Among the major creditors, owed more than $20,000 advanced transportation service, West Caldwell, NJ, $125,140. Anondius Incorporated, Acclaim, $1 million. Farm Club Online, $300,000. Paul Heyman, claiming back wages, $128,000. Madison Square Garden Cable, $244,000. American Cable Productions, $243,000. Gregory Bagarozzi, house show promoter, $20,576.93. Eugene Buffa Jr., lawyer, $188,000. William Byrd, producer of TNN Show, $64,000. Chase Manhattan Bank of Jericho, New York, $29,441. Eugene Kierkowski, lawyer, $183,000. Donahue, Granda and Doria, accountants, $50,000. Richard Heyman, who funded the company for many years, $3,575.429.19. Sulamita Heyman, $226,500. Hoffinger, Freeland, Dobrich and Stern lawyers, $140,000. In Demand Cable, $150,000. Steve Carl, $50,000. Peter Klomka, PTN Media, $50,000. Original San Francisco Toymakers, $250,000. Players Computers Incorporated, $24,640. Stonecutter Productions, Carl, $75,000. Top Rope Productions, $25,000. Beigel Broadcasting, Chicago 5, $60,000. World Wrestling Federation Entertainment, $587,500. As well as these performers: William Alfonso Fonzie, $5,000. Scott Antal, Scotty Anton, unknown.
Joseph Bonsignori Joey Styles, $50,480.
Mike Bucci, Nova, $4,000. Don Callis, $12,000. Udanjali Louis Dangerously, $7,000. Michael DiPaolo Roadkill, $21,250.
Joseph Dorgan, Swinger, unknown. John Finnegan, unknown.
Francine Fournier, $47,275. James Fullington, Sandman, unknown. Terry Guerin, Rhino, $50,000.
Matt Hyson, Spike Dudley, unknown.
Francisco Islas, Super Crazy, $5,000. Mike Keckner, unknown. Patrick Kenny, Simon Diamond, $9,000. Tom Laughlin, Tommy Dreamer, $100,000.
Jury Lynn, unknown.
James Maritato, Little Guido, $25,000. Troy Martin, Shane Douglas, $48,000. Jim Mitchell, Sinister Minister, unknown. James Molyneux, unknown. Dan Morrison, Danny During, $2,100. Peter Polacco, Just Incredible, $7,990. Dawn Salpis, Dawn Marie, $9,000.
John Reschner, Balls Mahoney, $4,000.
Ken Ryan Inhouse, Jack Victory, $3,000. Robert Shatkovsky, Rob Van Dam, $150,000.
Yoshihiro Tajiri, $5,000. John Watson, Mikey Whipwreck, $12,000.
As if pro wrestling needed any more news of this type this month, the Winston-Salem Journal on April 28 reported that Wake Forest University School of Medicine found that teenagers in Forsyth County that are pro wrestling fans are more likely than their peers to have violent dating relationships. The story, which was carried internationally by the AP and also covered in the UK by the BBC, regarded Dr. Robert Durant presenting his findings on April 27 in Baltimore at a meeting of the Pediatric Academic Societies.
Over 11% of boys and 18% of girls who were wrestling fans had a physical fight while on a date,
far above the norm for that age group in the country.
Durant noted that this study didn't prove that wrestling caused teenagers to fight physically on dates, but he did say the study showed that having the behavior of fighting amongst the sexes modeled for you over and over on television is a statistically significant reinforcing factor.
Data provided by Durant to The Observer shows a direct correlation, stronger among girls than boys, in several antisocial behaviors that increases noticeably based on frequency of viewing pro wrestling. The students were to monitor how many times they watched pro wrestling on television over a 2-week period. The survey found that 62% of the boys and 35% of the girls had watched some portion of a pro wrestling show over a 2-week period. The stats were broken down by number of viewings over 2 weeks from 1 to 9, and the percentages of violent behavior increased incrementally with every increase of watching. The fact that 18 different numbers told the same story pretty much rules out a fluke result. Based on the two survey dates, approximately 25% of the boys and 9% of the girls would be hardcore fans, which meant that had watched at least 6 pro wrestling television shows over the previous 2 weeks. Gary Davis of the WWF responded by saying, "There is a lot of discussion going on as to how much influence television has on the behavior of teenagers.
It's WWF TV, not a children's show, but if a parent decides it's appropriate for their child, we urge them to watch with them."
The parent is the final arbiter in the home as to what is and is not an appropriate entertainment choice.
Durant's study measured links between smoking, drinking, drug use, fighting and carrying weapons with watching wrestling. The survey was originally not done regarding wrestling but simply involving those activities at the high school level.
The strongest category where wrestling fans were above the statistical norm was teenagers getting into fights themselves. Second was teenagers getting into fights which ended up with medical attention being needed. And third, and for whatever reason, the category that got the most publicity, was teenagers starting physical fights against their date. Among the general public, 4.6% of boys and 9.4% of girls had started a physical fight while on a date. Keep in mind, these are not the numbers of non-wrestling fans, because most of the boys surveyed had watched wrestling, and 1/3 of the girls had. Figures for those who hadn't watched any wrestling would be lower, 3.7% of boys and 8.5% of girls. For those who watched only one pro wrestling show over the previous 2 weeks, the numbers increased to 5.2% of boys and 11.1% of girls. However, among those who watched 4 times or more over the 2 weeks, which would be the serious wrestling fans, the numbers were 7.6% of boys having started fights while on a date and 18.2% of girls, or basically being double the level of those who never watched wrestling. The increases continued at the same correlation up to 9 or more viewings over a 2-week period. Durant said the degree of meanness that takes place has escalated significantly. If they're watching television and women are referred to in a derogatory manner, that's going to influence what children think is acceptable. The study was performed after the principal, William P. at Phila Middle School told him they had a rash of injuries at recess by children between the ages of 11 and 13 imitating wrestling moves on each other. However, the survey showed a greater degree of increased girl-on-boy violence among girl wrestling fans than the other way around. The study measured not only fighting on dates, but fighting in general, victimization in fights as well as drug usage. There was no difference in being victims of violent acts or vandalization of personal belongings by the general public as compared with casual or serious wrestling fans, even those who watched 9 or more wrestling shows over the previous week, which would seem to indicate that the peer group risk factor in explaining the other numbers away isn't a valid argument.
Girls who watch were far more likely than boys to have different behavior, such as increased violence and drug use, than boys who watched regularly.
With women, in every category surveyed with the exception of drinking and driving, with no increase, and a very tiny increase in substance abuse, there were significant increased levels the more wrestling was viewed.
With boys, the increases weren't anywhere near as significant.
Probably the biggest question as to the results is more a question of what they mean.
There is a strong argument that people who are more prone to acting violent are also more prone to being fans of fighting, whether it be boxing or wrestling or even football. Durant knew of no studies that studied being fans of boxing, ice hockey or football, violent pro sports, with increases in violent or antisocial behavior, so there are no comparisons as to whether pro wrestling is as bad or worse in this category. There are numerous surveys that show links of violent viewing on television and violent behavior, and those studies uniformly show that whether the violence is real or not has no bearing, in that an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie that every knows is make-believe has the same correlation with watching a violent crime on the news.
Is it the watching wrestling that causes the increase in physical violence, or is it that the type of person more apt to that is simply more likely to also enjoy pro wrestling? The latter of which would yield the same results, but pro wrestling would not be a causal factor. It didn't take a researcher to see that wrestling is on Monday night and Tuesday you've got kids who are wrestling, P said. It didn't take a rocket scientist.
If there is evidence that this behavior is escalated on a Tuesday or a Friday, which hasn't been proven, that would be a better study as to if pro wrestling was a causal factor as opposed to the latter theory of the study. Wrestling supporters brought up a survey that showed more than 80% of adult wrestling fans watch wrestling with their children and consider time spent watching wrestling as important family time.
Hawaiian Super Brawl and AMC Pancration competitor Kim Mason, 22, of Seattle was charged with first-degree murder on April 30th in the death of Hartanto Santoso, his alleged former gay lover. Santoso, 31, of Kirkland, Washington, has been missing since February 19. A witness came forward last week and tied the 2-month-long investigation together according to a story in the Seattle Times. The witness said he picked up Mason on that night at the Seattle-Tacoma airport, and he had dried blood on his hands and a large bandage on his right thigh. Mason is a student of Matt Hume, one of the most respected MMA trainers in the world and a former top competitor. Police saw a videotape of Mason taken on March 13, showing the same wound on the right thigh. Santoso's car was found at the airport parking garage on February 21 and the blood in the driver's seat of the car matched the location of where Mason's right leg would have been sitting. The police theory is that Mason stabbed Santoso at Santoso's apartment and in the fight, had his thigh cut. They believe he disposed of the body, then drove Santoso's car to the airport to give the impression that he flew away and left town to explain his absence. Santoso's body has never been found. Police said that Santoso was set to testify against Mason in a kidnapping case involving both of them. According to prosecutors, on January 23, when Santoso was in Mason's apartment in Redmond, Washington, Mason allegedly choked him out, bound and gagged him. Santoso awoke and claimed Mason pointed a handgun at him and told him to write him a $700 check, allegedly to pay off a drug debt. When he did, Mason let him go, but Santoso went to the police after the incident. The police arrested Mason and charged him with kidnapping a few days later. Mason told police he choked out Santoso because he was resisting an unwanted sexual advance. The police report stated the two had a sexual relationship in the past. Santoso's friends are said to be furious at the judge who released Mason without bail after the kidnapping charge. Prosecutors asked for, and were turned down in their request, for a $200,000 bail. Due to a delay at Nielsen, Raw and WWF weekend ratings were unavailable at press time. An interesting question is, does acquiring WWF strengthen a network? The obvious answer is yes, in that Raw's ratings themselves are the highest rated regular show on cable except during football season. Last year in April, TNN averaged in 0.6 in prime time, and this year it's a 1.0. However, if you take the 2 hours of Raw out of the mix, the rest of TNN's primetime average is 0.55. In other words, it isn't the "We've Got Pop" slogan or any other programming as a team effort in the change in ratings. It is just adding one specific show which has zero carryover ratings for the rest of the network that makes the entire difference in the ratings. USA was down 26% losing Raw, but their profits were up from last year, so it doesn't matter. TNT was down 21% losing Nitro, and TBS down 12% losing Thunder. SmackDown on April 26 drew a 3.7 rating, tying its low for the year. Without an announced main event, the promise of surprise opponents didn't whet fans' interest enough going against blockbuster competition like Survivor, 16.6, and CSI, 14.4. NBC threw everything it had with kind of disappointing results as Friends with Winona Ryder and A Promised Girl Kiss only did a 10.9. Will and Grace with Woody Harrelson did a 10.5, and Just Shoot Me with Kathy Lee Gifford did a 10.2. Galavision Lucha Libre on April 24 drew a 1.4 Hispanic rating. Observer poll results. Traditional Observer pay-per-view poll results based on phone calls, fax messages and emails to the Observer as of Tuesday, April 10. WWF Backlash. Thumbs up 78, 33.6%. Thumbs down 55, 23.7%. In the middle 99, 42.7%. Best match poll: Chris Benoit vs. Kurt Angle, 104. Raven vs. Rhino, 69. Steve Austin and Triple H vs. Undertaker and Kane, 27. Worst match poll: Big Show vs. Shane McMahon, 64. William Regal vs. Chris Jericho, 54. X-Pac and Justin Credible and Albert vs. Dudley's, 24. Steve Austin and Triple H vs. Undertaker and Kane, 22. Chris Benoit vs. Kurt Angle, 15. IATA poll results. Results of the daily poll on the IATA.com website. New questions will be up every day at approximately 3 p.m. Eastern Time, with the results being announced at the start of the Wrestling Observer Live internet audio show the following day as well as each week here. What did you think of SmackDown, April 26th? A. Excellent 6.3%. B. Good 19.9%. C. Average 28.5%. D. Bad 14.1%. E. Awful 31.3%. What did you think of Backlash? A. Thumbs up 16.1%. B. Thumbs down 11.9%. C. Thumbs in the middle 24.6%. D. Didn't see the show 47.5%. Wrestling Observer Live airs every Monday through Friday on the IATA.com sports channel on the internet from 5 to 7 p.m. Eastern Time and 2 to 4 p.m. Pacific Time. The show is available live throughout the world, and the most recent show is available 24 hours per day on archives to listen to at your convenience. Brian Alvarez and I open the show every day running down the latest news. We either have guests the remainder of the show taking listeners' phone calls and emails, or we take calls and emails. Even if you don't have access to a computer and just want to talk wrestling, you can reach us between those hours within North America at 1-877-392-3299, 1-800-77-AYATA-99. You can always check the WrestlingObserver.com website for the latest guest information. Upcoming guests include Bobby Heenan on May 9th and Nick Bockwinkel on May 10th. Pro Wrestling Noah. Estimated average attendance March 1, 2101. February 2001, 2109. Estimated average gate March 1, $88,700. February 2001, $67,490. Percentage of house shows sold out March 1, 30.0. February 2001, 63.6. Mexico. Time Warner officially sent word to Rey Mysterio Jr. that he could no longer wrestle in Tijuana, so he missed the April 27th show, which was advertised as Mysterio Jr. and Nicho Psicosis, and Leo Del Santo as the main event face trio, with Nicho and Santo teaming coming off their hot hair versus mask match a few weeks ago against Cien Caras and Mascara Ano 2000 and Rey Mysterio.
They drew another sellout of about 5,500 with Lismark Jr. replacing Mysterio Jr. May 4th in Tijuana will be headlined by Santo and Nicho and La Parca vs. Juventud Guerrera and Scorpio Jr. and El Hijo del Pierroth Jr. plus Mr. Niebla and Brazo de Plata and Super Parca vs. Mysterio and Halloween and Damien. On the April 27th show after his team won, Nicho was in the ring doing a post-match dance when Juvie, who wasn't booked on the show, did a surprise run-in on him.
The little bit of hair Nicho has grown back in the last few weeks is now dyed blue. To show how hot the city is with 3 different promoters, Promociones Baja California, Promociones de Mora and AAA all running on different Fridays at the Auditorio and all doing business, they in this week at an April 29th show at the Palenque, a smaller building a few blocks from the Auditorio,
and drew about 2,500 for Rayo de Jalisco Jr. and Atlantis and La Fiera vs. Mysterio and Damien and Halloween. They are working on finalizing paperwork to get Michael Modest and Chuck Palumbo to work for Promociones BC.
Because of the promotional rivalry, not getting proper paperwork can be a problem, as Sabu, when he worked there, was apparently given a lot of problems, and they've been waiting for Conan, who hasn't wrestled but has done run-ins, to do a run-in, but he hasn't been there of late.
Even though they are there now almost every week, it's said that La Parca and Brazo de Plata doing the same comedy routines are tearing the house down and people are coming back for repeat business.
April 27th Arena Mexico was headlined by El Satanico and Shocker and Black Warrior over Ultimo Guerrero and Bestia Salvaje and Emilio Charles Jr. via 2 straight DQ falls. First fall saw them unmask Warrior for the DQ. They did a 3-on-2 in the second fall as Warrior went to the back to get a new mask. Charles Jr. low-blowed Satanico for the second fall DQ. On May 4th, it'll be Satanico and Shocker and Warrior versus Charles and Guerrero and Salvaje plus Rayo and Lismark Jr. and Negro Casas versus Panther and Fuerza Guerrera and Mascara Ano 2000. Pimpinela Escarlata won the Mexican national middleweight title from Espectro Jr. on April 27th in Querétaro at the AAA TV taping.
Billy Boy also beat Angel Mortal in a hair match on that show.
The commission in Mexico City announced actual weight classes as it pertains to the championship matches. The never talked about enanos, dwarfs, minis, midgets, and mujeres, women's division, have no weight limit.
The men's divisions are featherweight, under 150, lightweight, 151 to 165, welterweight, 166 to 183, middleweight, 184 to 202, light heavyweight, 203 to 224,
cruiserweight, 225 to 235, and heavyweight, 236 and up. Puerto Rico.
WWC business has picked back up over the last few weeks with the return of Carlos Colon doing 6-person mains with Carlos and Carly and Stacy Colon against Ray Gonzalez and Nene and La Tigresa. Thunder and Lightning regained the WWC tag titles beating Rico Suave and Eddie Watts on April 28 in Quillay, Puerto Rico.
Chris Grant beat Rex King to win the WWC TV title on April 21 in Orocovic, Puerto Rico.
Ricky Banderas regained the IWA title from Shane on April 28 in Guaynabo.
This pretty much had to happen since they had booked Banderas to the May 5 FMW Big Show in a title defense. After the match, Jose Estrada announced a big surprise for Star Corporation. Lead heels would be coming next week. All Japan. The latest wrestling war battle is over the memory of Jumbo Tsuruta. Last week Noah announced its Tsuruta Memorial Show on June 10 in Tsuruta's hometown of Yamanashi. To beat them to the punch, All Japan a few days later announced its first annual Jumbo Tsuruta Memorial Show for May 20 at Korakuen Hall. When Tsuruta died, from all accounts of those who were friends with him, and it was right at the time the split was taking place, he was backing Mitsuharu Misawa, making the split since he was politically removed from All Japan not all that long before his death. At this point it appears that both Genichiro Tenryu and Toshiaki Kawada will miss the next tour due to neck and arm injuries respectively. Kawada had surgery on his right elbow on April 18 to remove torn cartilage and will return to action for the double Budokan Wars starting on June 6. Tenryu returns on June 8 at the second Budokan War. The All Japan vs. New Japan Budokan Wars start on June 6, which is technically a New Japan show, with a best-of-5 series with Kawada vs. Satoshi Kojima. Kawada wins a great match. Mike Barton vs. Manabu Nakanishi, very scary match. Mitsuya Nagai vs. Takashi Iizuka. Masahito Kakihara vs. Minoru Tanaka, a show-stealing undercard match. And El Samurai vs. Masa Fuchi. The All Japan show on June 8 has Tenryu defending the Triple Crown against Keiji Muto. As it turns out, they aren't going to do the tag title versus tag title match for political reasons, so instead Johnny Smith and Taiyo Kiya defend the tag titles against Nakanishi and Yutaka Yoshi, plus Shinya Makabe and Yuji Nagata will challenge the winner of the May 20th Korakuen Hall match with Kakihara and Nagai versus Yoshiaki Fujiwara and Fuchi to bring back the All-Asian Tag Team titles, Kawada versus Hiroyoshi Tenzan, rematch of their great January 4th Dome match, and Steve Williams and Mike Rotundo versus Hiro Saito and Kojima. Jinsei Shinzaki works 5 dates on the tour. Vampiro is likely to start working here after his WCW deal is ended. Both this group, Noah and New Japan, have interest in displaced WCW wrestlers that aren't going to wind up in WWF, particularly if they have potential to be big names for the Japanese market. Buff Bagwell, who did really well in New Japan a few years back as Scott Norton's tag partner, may be a wrestler, like Scott Hall, who if WWF has no interest in him, may make a regular career in Japan if he wants it. Pro Wrestling Noah. The first Mitsuharu Misawa defense of the GHC title will be May 18th in Sapporo against Akira Tao. The match was set up on the April 26th Korakuen Hall show where Misawa and Akitoshi Saito and Yoshinari Ogawa beat Tao and Jun Akiyama and Jun Izumida. After the match, Tao laid out both Misawa and Akiyama, the two biggest stars of the company, with Nadawa's a sumo move similar to a choke slam. They are also doing a history storyline in that it is almost exactly 5 years, May 24, 1996, of Tao's Triple Crown title win over Misawa, which was also in Sapporo. Nothing else really special on the tour, which starts on May 12th and May 13th with shows at different Ariake. The May 18th Sapporo show also has Takao Mori and Yoshihiro Takayama, so he is working a full schedule leading to his Pride match with Kazuyuki Fujita, which should tell something, versus Vader and Scorpio. The final show is May 25th at Yokohama Bunka Gym with Mitsuharu Misawa and Takuma Sano versus Amori and Takayama. 2 days before Pride, Tao and Tamon Honda versus Vader and Scorpio and Jun Akiyama and Kentaro Shigai and Yoshinobu Kanemaru versus Takeshi Morishima and Takeshi Rikio and Akitoshi Saito. Misawa is coming to the US at the end of May for 9 days to scout wrestlers to bring in as regulars now that he has television money to work with. He's supposed to, along with Vader, scout in Hawaii, Tennessee, Missouri, looking at some of Harley Race's students, in California. This group is expected to get their TV show on in both Taiwan and Korea. April 13th TV was the Misawa vs. Akiyama GHC tournament match. Match saw both guys going on the idea they've wrestled so often, block or counter trademark moves. Akiyama sidestepped and elbow off the apron, for example. Crowd got into it after Misawa hit German suplexes and tiger drivers for near falls. Akiyama hit 2 exploders for near falls. They ended up on the floor and Misawa gave Akiyama a tiger driver on the floor, but Akiyama recovered and gave Misawa an exploder on the floor. Finish was so 70s, with Misawa holding Akiyama's leg, not allowing him to beat the 20 count at 13:34. Fans hated this, of course. They did pop for the announcement of the restart. Akiyama got off first with a brainbuster and a guillotine. Misawa broke free and they traded some cradles on the mat until Misawa got a 3 in 130. Something about restarting and going 130, Hart Michaels, this bout and Benoit Angle, that is a natural letdown, leads you to wonder why it's done that way. This was nowhere near the level of the bouts the two used to have, but with a better booked finish it would have been good. 2 1/2 stars. April 20th TV saw the Misawa vs. Takayama GHC tournament final. Somehow these two did a hell of a match. It started slow and was boring for about 9 minutes. They had a sequence of trading hard elbow by Misawa and high kicks by Takayama. Takayama nailed him with a real stiff high kick and a scary roundhouse kick for a great near fall, then got big pops for 2 German suplexes, both of which Misawa kicked out of. Takayama delivered really hard kicks to Misawa's upper back. He then, with Misawa on his knees, went for a hard kick to the chest but got a little high and nailed Misawa's jaw. His jaw was split and bleeding pretty bad. At this point, and imagine this in the heat of a match, going to a commercial break, came back and Misawa started with the elbows and went for various arm bars, both regular and reverse Fujiwara styles and rope breaks. Tiger driver by Misawa for a near fall. Takayama came back with a hard kick to the back and a tiger suplex for a near fall. Misawa then destroyed him with elbows all over the place, like a boxer weakening his foe, readying a knockout, and some of those elbows, including a reverse elbow, were brutal. He hit a blow that looked to be a finish for a near fall. Takayama even kicked out of the running elbow. Misawa finally did the emerald erosion for the pin in 21-12. Takayama still isn't any good, but this match was excellent. 4 stars. April 20th TV drew a 2.4 rating, which in that time slot, Friday at 1:55 am, is very good. The April 27th TV show aired matches from the 01 April 18th. New Japan.
The best of the Super Juniors tournament bracketing will be Bracket A, having Jushin Liger, El Samurai Silver King, Chris Candido, Grand Naniwa from All Japan, and Wataru Inoue.
Bracket B will have Minoru Tanaka, Akira, Dr. Wagner Jr., Shocker Makabe, and Katsuyori Shibata. The winner of each tournament meets in the championship match on June 4th at the Osaka Furitsu Gym. May 18th at Korakuen Hall in junior matches has Liger vs. Inoue, King vs. Candido, Tanaka vs. Makabe, Wagner vs. Shocker and Samurai, and Shibata vs. Akira and Naniwa. Kendo Kashin was pulled from the tournament and will miss the tour so he can train for the Ryan Gracie match, although he's still working every night on the current tour. Antonio Inoki returned from the US on April 30th with photos with Mike Tyson to prove his much joked about negotiations with him were real.
There was a photo of the two shaking hands, and another of Inoki with a choke on Tyson, both taken on April 27th in Las Vegas.
Inoki said he's continuing to negotiate and would like to bring Tyson to Japan to appear at a pro wrestling show at either Sumo Hall or Tokyo Dome, but not as a fighter since Tyson's on a full fight schedule again. That's basically similar to the real Hickson-Gracie story.
On May 1st, a Tokyo newspaper reported in a front-page story that Gracie vs. Riki Choshu was finalized for the January 4th Tokyo Dome. It is not unusual for sports papers in Japan, particularly those covering pro wrestling, like the old wrestling magazine stories in the US, to make up sensational sports headlines that are forgotten the next day.
Inoki and Gracie have met since both live in Los Angeles. While the Gracie family has hated pro wrestlers since the 50s when pro wrestling was a huge deal in Brazil, it doesn't even exist there anymore. On TV, Inoki has now worked with Henzo in pro wrestling, and the walls seem to have broken down since Hickson has made so much money working with wrestlers.
At this point, the belief is Hickson would be willing to appear at a New Japan big show, but would not do a pro wrestling match.
Masahiro Chono is also going to miss the tour since there is just so much he can work nowadays. Katsuhiko Nagata debuts as the second for his brother in the May 5th Fukuoka Dome match against Rainy Martinez. At the April 28th house show in Beppu, the main event saw Scott Hall and Chono over Keiji Muto and Taiyo Kiya when Chono pinned Muto with a Yakuza kick, which is the politically easy finish. Any finish regarding Kiya has its political issues.
After the match, Chono said that he, Tenzan, and Kojima are the big three in Team 2000 and challenged Muto to pick two partners for the Fukuoka Dome, and he picked Kiya and Hiroshi Hazi to set up the six-man match that we reported on last week.
When we reported on it, it had yet to be announced and it wasn't public knowledge in Japan until after this angle.
Muto and Kiya on April 29th in Nagasaki beat Tenzan and Tatsutoshi Goto, and on April 30th in Kagoshima beat Nagata and Yoshi.
April 14th TV was mainly rerun material from the Osaka Dome special from 5 days earlier. They aired Jushin Liger vs. Kazunari Murakami, Choshu and Shiro Koshinaka vs. Kaoda, and Fuchi and Shinya Hashimoto vs. Kensuke Sasaki.
The first match, which only went 147, didn't air on TV because it all took place during the commercial break. I've got no idea why they didn't have them do a 7 minutes match, a finish, and then do the rest of the angle as they did it.
Crowd was really hot for what they did, but they would have been just as hot if they had done a real match, and nobody would have felt ripped off about a match that was hyped real well with good angles going and not taking place.
They worked the match to be a shoot.
Liger took Murakami down, who took a guard, reversed positions and started pounding on Liger. Murakami threw the ref out of the ring and went after Liger's mask and ripped it up. Liger went berserk and tore his own mask off and tackles Murakami when everyone ran in to break things up, and the bell rang for the DQ for throwing the ref out.
At that point was when the TV commercial ended and Ogawa was on the mic. Choshu came out, etc. April 21st was the Kill the Junior Heavyweights show from Osaka Dome.
It was the first 3 matches on the card that didn't air on the live TV special. Takashi Iizuka beat Minoru Tanaka in 9:37. Technically an excellent match. Tanaka is so good as a worker and at using shoot moves in a worked sense that he's the closest thing in wrestling to Kiyoshi Tamura of a few years ago. He's so great on the ground.
Iizuka did a good job here in that he gave Tanaka almost the entire match, so fans believed Tanaka had a chance.
Still, they've been programmed so strongly to believe the junior heavyweight doesn't have the chance that the heat still wasn't as good as it should have been. And it's still the junior heavyweight champ and most talented worker in the company jobbing to a heavyweight who isn't considered a top heavyweight, although I can't argue this specific result since Iizuka is in more high-profile a spot than next Dome. At one point Iizuka sold he was knocked out by a knee as he shot, which put the bout in jeopardy.
Iizuka also had his choke blocked and Tanaka turned it into a flying armbar for a rope break.
Tanaka did all the hard kicks and lots of submissions, and Iizuka usually did counters. It was old-style psychology with a believability factor, but more modern moves and stiff kicks.
Iizuka got the choke in the middle pretty much out of nowhere, which is more realistic than the building to a finish that pro wrestling does, but also doesn't build heat and excitement for the finish.
Aside from the finish, the match was really good.
3 1/4 stars, Yutaka Yoshi beat Shinya Makabe.
Bout had no heat early, although what they did was good. Lots of mat work and hard chops back and forth. Yoshi did a leapfrog spot and fell on his face on the landing.
Give him credit, the crowd started to laugh, but he ignored it and got real aggressive and took people back into the match.
Makabe did a few near falls. Bout ended when Yoshi did a Canadian, Don Leo Jonathan style, shoulder backbreaker into a power slam for a near fall, and then did a second one for a submission in 8:59. It was still a crummy heavyweight, although one who gets a push, beating a junior heavy who is really good. 3 stars, Brian Johnston beat Kendo Kashin with a guillotine in 2:20. Not bad, but too short.
Johnson actually looked real good doing strong mat work.
Kashin did a low blow and had hit a flying arm bar. Johnson broke it, needing 2 power bombs. After the first, Kashin still hung on.
As Kashin charged, Johnson got the guillotine.
As you can imagine, this early in the match, fans weren't ready for the finish, so it was flat. 1/2 stars. Johnston's interview told a great story.
He said Kashin was great, but you can't give up 60 to 70 pounds, and that told the story.
He also said when you match a heavyweight against a junior heavyweight, that's what happens every time, and then quickly corrected himself, saying almost every time. He said he looked forward to Kashin's match with Ryan Gracie, but turned his head at that point, couldn't look directly at the camera, and said he thinks Kashin will do well. They earned the Fujita title win over Norton again. More worked shoot style. Very good considering Norton was in there. A hell of a lot better than the match Norton won the title in. They aired short clips from the April 14th All Japan Budokan show with Kojima and Tenzan over Steve Williams and George Hines and Muto pinning Kawada. Tag match looked really good based on what was shown, and heat was strong. Kojima pinned Hines after a killer of a lariat.
One messed up spot is after Kojima was covering Hines after a diving headbutt by Tenzan, Williams broke up the count at 1, but the ref kept counting anyway.
Luckily Hines knew enough to kick out, or it would have looked worse. Kawada may be the best worker in the game today.
Only clips aired, but he went 24-20 with Muto, and the match had super heat, and Muto is totally limited.
Kawada's selling was incredible, not overselling, but selling in subtle ways. After a knee to the head, Shining Wizard, Kawada's eyes went blank like he was stunned by a real punch, then Muto hit a harder Shining Wizard for the pin. April 21st TV drew a 3.0 rating. Other Japan notes. There is a lot of talk, which in itself shows how desperate Shinya Hashimoto must be, to do a Hashimoto vs Atsushi Onita match for the main event of the June 14th show at Osaka Castle Hall. Onita has proven to be a ticket seller in dream matches, but the matches are always terrible. The Osaka show was to be built around the idea the matches were shoots, but using Onita in the main event kills that concept. The Gia promotion, which is by far the #1 women's promotion in the world, ran a major show on April 29th, selling out Kawasaki City Gym with 4,000 fans, and did the unique main event booking with 4 singles matches, all involving Hall of Fame legends, and in every case, the HO fair went down clean. Sort of the opposite of the booking that everyone else does. Nagayo, who's injured her shoulder so badly she needs surgery, still went through with her match with champ Mayumi Ozaki in the main event. Nagayo was in bad enough shape they only did a 6-16 match ending with an armbar submission. She had already scheduled surgery for this week. Meiko Satomura, 21, who is the most promising of the younger wrestlers, beat Akira Hokuto in 21-33 via knockout of a no-time limit match. Devil Masami sold a knee injury, allowing Chikeo Nagashima to beat her via referee stoppage. Also, Kyoko Inoue beat Linus Asuka clean. With the exception of Asuka, all of the losers are going to be out of action for a while. Masami has a legit knee injury, and they use this match to tell that story. Hokuto is leaving wrestling for now. Her husband Kensuke Sasaki is taking a few months off New Japan to train in either the US or Europe for a comeback, so Hokuto is going to leave the country with her husband. Basically, putting the less well-known wrestlers over the big names appears to be something forced by circumstance more than trying to book the opposite of everyone, although Gia has been real good over the past year at elevating young talent, Satomura in particular. The Remix promotion, which ran a very well-received shoot women's tournament in December, is coming back with its second show on May 3rd at the Tokyo Yoyogi Gym.
They are bringing in fighters from Russia, Morocco, Netherlands, Korea and the United States in singles matches against mainly Japanese women wrestlers, including 110-pound Megumi Yabushita, who stole the show last year when she beat 320-pound Svetlana Gundarenko by running rings around her.
Promoter Yasuaki Shino says he'll have a third show in the summer and a fourth show before the end of the year, as well as promote a show in China.
May 10th, Battle Arts is running its biggest show of the year at Tokyo Komazawa Olympic Gym with Yuki Ishikawa vs. Kazunari Murakami, Alexander Otsuka vs. Shinjiro Otani, Muhammad Yone vs. Masato Tanaka, Great Sasuke vs. Takeshi Ono, Karl Malenko vs. Daijiro Matsui, Gedo and Jado vs. Ikuto Hidaka and Katsumi Yujuda, and Tatsuhito Takaiwa vs. Alvin Ken.
Michinoku Pro ran some major matches over the weekend. Great Sasuke retained the NWA middleweight title, beating Chad Collier on April 28 in Hamiya.
On April 29 in Niigata, Grand Hamada and daughter Ayako Hamada retained the P-Mix mixed tag team titles over Collier and Bionic J, Jessica Soto, while Jinsei Shinzaki and Dick Togo beat Sasuke and Tiger Mask as the main event. Gedo is now working for Michinoku Pro here and there. Stu Hart will have to undergo surgery to put in a pacemaker because his heart wasn't beating with enough power on its own due to his recent health problems caused by diabetes and edema.
John Sutton, better known as Sir Oliver Humperdinck, one of the top managers of the 70s in Montreal, Los Angeles, and actually many territories but far better known in Florida than anywhere else, had heart bypass surgery and a new aortic valve put in over the past week.
I'd guess him to be in his early 50s.
He's been suffering from heart problems for some time.
Humperdinck was well known early in his career as manager of the Hollywood Blondes, Jerry Brown and Dale Buddy Roberts, before settling in Florida in the late 70s and becoming a fixture in that part of the country.
Mickey J is putting together a benefit for him, which will include Bobby Heenan, Kurt Hennig, Hugh Morris, Kevin Sullivan, Steve Kieran and Jimmy Del Rey, going to Key West, where he has lived for several years, on May 16, and selling various merchandise.
Both Illinois and New York are looking at deregulating pro wrestling.
In Illinois, it's basically a money issue. The state spent $230,000 sending regulators to pro wrestling events last year, but the annual take on taxing these events was $200,000. The Illinois House has already voted not to continue wrestling regulation after the end of this year.
No word on what deregulation would entail.
The usual effects are an increase in garbage-style matches and blading on indie shows. It helps the indie business because it eliminates tax, which slightly helps the profit/loss ratio.
There are no studies on pro wrestling at all, so whether injuries are more frequent in non-regulated states as opposed to regulated states is unknown, along with the effects not having a doctor at live events has.
Of the numerous wrestling deaths, the only one where lack of regulation can be specifically pointed to is Gary Albright's. As in a state that required a physical and EKG, his heart problem would have been caught ahead of time.
Since Pennsylvania deregulated years ago and Japan doesn't have wrestling commissions, he was never tested, and died in the ring in Pennsylvania last year.
Ohio is looking at adding a 5% tax on pro wrestling receipts, similar to the tax it already has on boxing. The bill in Ohio calls for no regulation of wrestling, just taxing it, which they believe would add an estimated $150,000 per year to the state's income.
The only regulation would be to make sure promoters have insurance, have a bond placed, and make sure the wrestlers get paid. Steve Corino won the NWA title from Mike Rapada on April 24 in Tampa in 22:45 with his old school expulsion.
The change took place at the same Fort Homer Hesterly Armory in Tampa, which saw the NWA title, when it was the belt in the business, change hands twice, in 1969 when Dory Funk Jr. beat Gene Kiniski, and in 1979 when Dusty Rhodes beat Harley Race. The NWA tag titles also changed hands as Jimmy Del Rey's new heavenly bodies of Chris Nelson and Vito DiNucci won over Bad Attitude, Rick Michaels, and David Young. Chris Condito also worked the show, putting over Florida champ Buck Hugh, and the show opened with a speech by Brian Blair about Johnny Valentine, who headlined Florida and pretty much everywhere else in the 70s.
Stevie Ray is involved in booking a new startup company called United Wrestling Federation, using the old UWF initials that were used in that part of the country when Bill Watts was running it, that is going to be based in Dallas, but run basically Texas and parts of the old Mid-South territory as a regional,
with the weekly major shows being at either the Bronco Bowl in Dallas or the Cotton Bowl. He's looking at using a lot of older stars like Road Warriors, Jimmy Hart, Terry Funk, Roddy Piper, Jim Duggan, Canyon, and Nasty Boys, as well as a lot of the former WCW talent once they are officially off Time Warner payroll.
They are supposed to open on May 25th in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, May 26th in Monroe, Louisiana, and start running every Friday night in Dallas in June.
The Wrestling Express show on October 20th in Coventry, England will have Van Dam vs. Corino, Juventud Guerrera vs. Psicosis, a four-way with Alex Shane vs. Doug Williams vs. Scotty Rock vs. Guy Thunder for the Frontier Wrestling Association title, and Vampiro vs. Women of Wrestling, which is in severe financial trouble, lost $5.6 million over the past 2 quarters. The official pay-per-view gross was $105,000, which would be about 12,500 orders, which would be in 0.03 buy rate. A small-time live pay-per-view needs, depending on payroll and the like, anywhere from 30,000 to 40,000 orders to break even. The Armstrong family is talking about opening up a remake of the old Southeastern Championship Wrestling territory under the name of Southeastern Championship Wrestling.
They will run a wrestling school and hope to start television out of Pensacola. Don Callis was on Observer Live and said he's going back to school to get an MBA because he never wants to be put in the position he's in, where an unforeseen turn in the wrestling business, Bischoff not getting WCW after ECW folded, leaves him without a job.
Sting appeared on the April 28 edition of Walker, Texas Ranger, playing a drug-dealing biker who got his ass kicked by Norris. It looks like Terry Taylor will end up having some involvement in Burt Prentice's new USA Championship Wrestling promotion, which they are talking about a June launch out of Nashville. Not sure how this would be related to any Jerry Jarrett plans or not. Bret Hart did a show on April 27 in Middletown, New York, signing autographs at the big draw in a show that drew 1,100 fans. Hart never appeared before the crowd, but signed in a tent. Nova vs. Tony DeVito was the main event.
Backseat Boys vs. Donnie B and Rick Blade were said to have stolen the show with a 4 1/4 stars match.
Also appearing included Little Guido, Tiger Khan, who used to headline Stampede, Chris Chetty, and Crowbar. Another sad example of what has been the theme of wrestling over the last several weeks was USA Network releasing its financial figures.
Even though USA Network's ratings themselves are down since losing the WWF programming, their ad revenue and bottom line are doing better than at this time last year, even with a softer market.
Whenever the Carolina Hurricanes score on the video wall, they have Ric Flair, in a Hurricanes jersey, doing the Who, and the crowd responds in kind. Massachusetts State Senator Bob Hedlund of Weymouth, Massachusetts, is doing the figurehead commissioner role for Sheldon Goldberg's New England Championship Wrestling promotion. Hedlund is a longtime fan and asked for the spot. Goldberg was more skeptical, feeling Hedlund would take a lot of political flack for participating in pro wrestling angles. Hedlund disagreed, saying he felt the CW was clean fun and a positive version of pro wrestling, and if questioned, would say it doesn't have the negative aspects of the WWF product. Hedlund was said to have cut a good promo, but they are going to keep his role low-key.
Doug Williams on England is coming to the June 22 Somerville, Massachusetts show.
Prototype and Frankie Kazarian of UPW headlined his April 27 show. For those who remember old-time roller derby, Ronnie Robinson, who was one of Charlie O'Connell's biggest rivals as one of the major heels in the 60s and later the top male babyface star of the Chicago Pioneers in the 70s, passed away on April 20. I'd guess his age at around 60. His real name was Ronald Smith and was the son of Sugar Ray Robinson, which was actually a ring name, as his real name was Walker Smith. Robinson was the top men's star for the Pioneers in the biggest derby promotion in its history, a September 30, 1972 game at Comiskey Park in Chicago that drew a sellout 50,118 fans and turned away 10,000 more, and for a Memorial Day championship tournament at Shea Stadium the next year that drew 27,135 fans. And for a lesson regarding how quickly things change in sports entertainment, roller derby was out of business 6 months later. Dave Pound, another star from that era, passed away on April 30. He'd been in bad shape for a long time. Pound, who had guessed to be in his close to 70 at this point, was one of the best heels I ever saw in any form of sports entertainment in Los Angeles, and later did the exact same angles in Philadelphia and drew the largest crowd in the history of Los Angeles roller games, a sold-out forum with 17,000 fans in 1972 for his match race with John Hollover, who would get to own the Los Angeles Thunderbirds. Of all the fake battles of ownership in sports entertainment, this angle was the best paced and executed from start to finish. Seriously, if anyone who grown up on that angle and had used the good points in the WCW versus NWO feud, it would have ended up almost twice as big, and it would have had the right ending, as it did. Problem is, after doing that feud ended, the Los Angeles promotion never came close to the level of popularity that feud took it, although they probably lasted 4 more years as a full-time operation before fading into part-time and finally oblivion. There are huge wrestling lessons to be learned about the history of the roller derby, because most of the circumstances of 1972-73, both product internally, an incredible peak of TV ratings popularity and live show attendance during a sometimes bitter promotional war that faded, lack of creation of new stars, stale product, hotshot booking, and the economy of the country at that point in time, and sudden crashes of a product people thought would last forever by not updating, are identical with the last 2 years of pro wrestling. Tony St. Clair's 2 shows on May 18th and May 19th in Hanover, Germany will have Terry Funk, Fit Finlay, Chris Kanyon, Bruiser Mastino, Tiger Steel, Butch Masters, Robbie Brookside, Dan Collins and others. Donna Adamo, Electra from ECW, did a layout for the September Playboy. Vic Capri beat Donovan Morgan in a February 3rd fall ladder match on April 28 in Chicago to win both the APW Universal title and the Midwest Championship Wrestling title, as the 2 groups are doing talent exchanges. They headlined with Danny During and Roadkill vs. Julio De Niro and Chris Chetty. They said they'll be doing a TV taping on May 26 for a show that will debut over the summer on Wigi's out of Chicago, and that they will be doing a Super 8 type tournament, only using 8 tag teams, on July 14 in Chicago. MMA. Exactly where Pride and traditional pro wrestling separate got more blurry with the announcement of the Kazuyuki Fujita, New Japan, versus Yoshihiro Takayama, Pro Wrestling Noah, match on May 27 at the Yokohama Arena, with Takayama, at the press conference announcing the match, saying he wants the IWGP Heavyweight title on the line. As the storyline goes, Tatsumi Fujinami of New Japan is against the IWGP title being put on the line on a Pride show. Takayama is going to work the Noah House show schedule in May, while Fujita won't even work the Fukuoka Dome. Fujita, however, is said to be not leaving for California, where he does most of his training, because he suffered a left knee injury in his Osaka Dome match on April 9 against Scott Norton. The June 29 UFC pay-per-view will be headlined by Tito Ortiz vs. Elvis Sinosik from the Continental Airlines Arena in East Rutherford, New Jersey. This will be announced on the pay-per-view, but there is already advertising out for the match. They were hoping, and this would be a first, to have most of the June 29th show announced on the pay-per-view, as there has been a card basically on the books done, which is also a first, as usually these things don't come together until a few weeks before the show. The entire lineup, which should be clear by the end of the week, is a very strong lineup when it comes to evenly matched guys and good fights on paper to insiders, but is very weak when it comes to marquee UFC names. The Pele vs. Dave Mena match mentioned last week is an example of the entire show, although that bout is in jeopardy because Pele has signed to fight in Pride on June 27. Most likely opponent is Frank Trigg, and he may not be able to do both. UFC definitely has to rebuild, which means create names, because there are no inherent big money fights, and without the pay-per-view, no big money even if they were to do a big fight. It's just that the Meadowlands is a building that it's risky to be booking when you are still building, as opposed to having something big. Because there isn't a great deal of revenue generated by UFC yet because of its limited cable penetration, there isn't the money to spend on the big-name heavyweights unless they want to go even deeper in debt putting shows on, and that's probably not the right method for long-term survival. Still, my advice would have been, if Randleman has an impressive win over Chuck Liddell on May 4th, which is no guarantee, and comes out without any injuries, they should have at least considered a change. The first major book on the origins of MMA in the United States and its boom period on pay-per-view, called No Holds Barred: Evolution, written by Clyde Gentry, will be released in a few weeks. We'll review it after we get a copy. It covers the early years of UFC and similar events in Japan from 1993-97. K1 ran April 29 at Osaka Castle Hall before 12,000 fans, with a one-night tournament basically to redeem Jerome LeBanner after his March 17 match with Mike Bernardo. He was knocked out with a punch right after the bell, so bout was a no contest, but everyone saw him flattened. LeBanner and Ray Sefo were the only names in a tournament where the winner would qualify for the big K1 Grand Prix tournament at the end of the year. Even with a weak tournament, which was basically a one-man show, it drew a strong 16.7 rating on Fuji Network. Sefo won his first match against Adam Watt in 41 seconds but was injured and couldn't continue. Sefo went into the tournament with a hip injury, and it was pretty well known they were at best getting one fight out of him, but since the show was so lacking in names, they asked him to come in. LeBanner scored 3 first-round knockouts to win, including flooring Ebenezer Braga, who is actually a well-known Brazilian MMA guy who has lost to Dan Severn and Kazushi Sakuraba in the past and is more famous for a draw that he would have won had there been judges, against Masakatsu Funaki. LeBanner KO'd him in 103.
Scary thing on the show is Cepho beat Watt, but when Cepho couldn't continue, Watt, whose match was stopped after 2 knockdowns, was put back in the tournament.
K1 rules are dangerous enough as it pertains to fighting 3 times in one night when you win, let alone when you are stopped. Watt then knocked out Peter Graham, but came back for the finals and LeBanner pounded him in 152.
The idea a guy can be knocked out twice on the same show potentially is really dangerous.
Greg Kusatsa Jr., son of the 70s pro wrestling star, was stopped by Braga in the second round. K1 announced after the May 5th one-night tournament show in Las Vegas, they would be returning with another show on August 11th.
They also announced an August 19th show at the Saitama Super Arena build as the Andy Hug Memorial Show, where Hug's family would be brought in.
Hug passed away on August 24, 2000 while in Japan. WWF.
The future of the XFL seems in even greater jeopardy with the news that UPN is also seriously considering dropping the games next season.
UPN had only signed a 1-year deal with the league, and after midseason, it was by far its lowest-rated show. There are some fairly significant issues that would prevent a season year on UPN, said Adam Ware, the network's CEO, in a USA Today story. As to whether or not we can figure out a way to address them, I don't have that answer. As you look toward next year, it becomes even harder to do because you're going back to the same category of advertisers and have to convince them to come back. The damage done by the negative press and by the problems NBC affiliates had many be too much at the end of the day to say that a second season is going to happen. XFL President Basil DeVito has said that the league couldn't continue for a second season if its only TV deal was with TNN.
Top 3 matches at Judgment Day on May 20th in Sacramento look to be Austin vs. Undertaker for WWF title, Triple H vs. Kane for IC title, and Chyna vs. Lita for women's title. Raw on April 30th in Milwaukee may have been the poorest received Raw of the year, coming off an average pay-per-view show. The first hour was good but the second hour was bad, not so much in execution, but in booking, which was scary. Angle opened with an interview and got great heat. Benoit came out and the two got into a brawl which had more action in 1 minute than in the rest of the show combined. The upshot of all this was Benoit left with Angle's medals. Angle, in far too comic a bit, spent the rest of the show looking for Benoit, who had already left. Matt Hardy pinned Edge to keep the European title in 421. Bout was good but heat wasn't good. Christian and Jeff were fighting outside and Edge had Matt pinned when Jeff threw Christian in the ring and the ref stopped the count. Edge got mad and shoved him out of the ring for blowing the match, and when he turned around, Matt hit the twist of fate for the pin. X-Pac pinned Spike Dudley in 319 with the X Factor in a good match. Only problem is with X-Pac winning, it meant we had to hear that entrance music twice. Stephanie, with a nice made-up bruise from the pay-per-view, said she wanted Test to pay for what he did at the pay-per-view. They did vignettes that were pretty flat with Crash Holly getting drunk and taken at cards by the APA. This was one of those inside ribs that 99.9% of the audience doesn't get, because Crash has gotten into trouble for getting drunk in the past, including fined once for it during a public appearance at WWF New York several months ago. With Crash getting taken, Bob showed up and broke it up and challenged the APA to a fight. Rhino pinned Jericho to keep the hardcore title in 352. Regal was at ringside getting into it with Ross. Edge and Christian came out. All the weapons, including Christian using a fire extinguisher to Jericho's face, setting him up for the gore. After the match, Jericho destroyed Regal with garbage can shots. Vince and Stephanie came out. Vince did this interview talking about Triple H and Austin, but he was really talking about himself. Vince was furious about Stephanie's bruise and ordered Austin to take out the injured Kane. Linda appeared on TV from WWF New York and said that she would postpone divorce proceedings if Vince would change the main event on TV to Austin vs. Taker. So Vince made the facials and he changed it and Austin freaked out. APA beat Bob and Crash with Crash acting drunk the entire match, even supposedly hurling, although he didn't appear to have Draw's talents of being able to do it on command. Bradshaw pinned Bob with a lariat in 352. Bob and Crash fought after the match. Triple H destroyed Test, leaving him for dead with chair shot after chair shot, getting DQ'd in 56. It's almost like they're trying to copy WCW. They easily could have done a 6 minutes match, given Test lots of offense to elevate him, and have it end the same way. This way Test wouldn't look like such a punk and be buried. Kane saved him with his one-arm house cleaning. Showed a clip of Rock at the Mummy Returns premiere. Chyna pinned Stratus in 124, killing her dead after a press slam. Lita came out and challenged Chyna, basically fawning all over her and making it so that if anyone actually wanted to see the match, by the time these two were laughing about it, they would have no interest. Perhaps the most botched up interview segment in a long time even included the music accidentally playing for Lita in the middle.
Seriously, whoever wrote the lines for these two didn't grow up watching guys do promos that led to people buying tickets. I guess the idea is for China to go in as friends, then turn on her at the pay-per-view.
The bad news means that it'll lead to rematches and more TV time spent on this feud.
Austin and Triple H destroyed Kane backstage.
Undertaker came back for the save and laid out Triple H. Austin and Undertaker brawled into the ring and did a 57-second main event, ending in a DQ finish when Triple H interfered.
Crowd groaned a little when the bell rang to end Triple H's match, but they really groaned when the bell rang this time. Then they started booing, and it was that WCW booing at the end of a TV show that doesn't mean they are getting the good heat. Post-match was strong with both destroying Taker with a sledgehammer. Except for the fact there was no spray paint used, it looked just like nitro, and that isn't good. Kane came out, and just like a WCW babyface would and with test, the heels punked him out without even making him look decent first. They did the broken arm deal with a chair on him. Austin destroyed Undertaker with numerous chair shots and they left with great heat.
They could have done all they did storyline-wise, and still done a 7-minute match with a run-in so fans wouldn't have felt so ripped off being hyped for something that basically wasn't delivered.
Notes from the May 1st tapings for Heat and SmackDown, which sounded a lot better. Randy Orton debuted in a speaking jobber role on Heat for Gunn. SmackDown opened showing a video where Austin destroyed Taker's bike. They announced Kane is out indefinitely, which means not very long, with a broken arm. Undertaker claimed in the interview that he burned his own brother's face off by setting a fire. Didn't he kill his parents in that fire as well? So imagine what he'd do to his enemies. Vince came out and said he's got a mystery man to settle the score with Taker in the main event. Triple H beat Jeff Hardy to keep the IC title. Austin was at ringside. Taker came out with a chain and attacked Austin and they brawled to the back. While this was going on, it was pedigree and pin clean in the middle. Backstage, Austin attacked Taker again, but it wound up with Taker throwing Austin through a window pane, which would have had a lot more of an effect if they didn't just do that angle for no reason as a transition move in a hardcore match with Raven. Austin sells it like the glass got in his eye and he was blind. The trainer examined Austin and said he'd have to go to the emergency room. Raven pinned X-Pac with the DDT, but after, Albert and Credible laid Raven out. Guess that means the song played twice again. EMTs said Austin had glass in both eyes and was taken in an ambulance. Guess who was driving the ambulance? In the scene immortalized in Wrestling with Shadows, it was the hated enemy, Undertaker, who attacked Triple H and attacks a blind Austin. Vince and Stephanie told Deborah, who arrived late, what happened. Deborah goes into Taker's locker room. Taker tells her this is between the men, not the women. She slapped him. Bob Holly pinned Angle when Benoit came to ringside wearing Angle's medals and Bob schoolboyed him. Vince did an interview. Taker came out and decked Vince and cornered Stephanie, but instead of doing anything to her, just told her to tell her dad that he's reclaimed his yard. At the hospital, Triple H gives the news that Austin may never see again due to the eye injuries. Matt Hardy and Jericho beat Edge and Christian and Rhino when Eddie Guerrero came out and attacked Edge, allowing Matt to hit the twist of fate and get the pin. Lynn pinned Sexay to keep the light heavy belt using the ropes for leverage. Austin returned it was fast from being blind, and said that Triple H had been arrested for going crazy at the hospital. Undertaker vs. Rikishi is the main event. Austin went from being blind from doing a main event run-in, but his run-in was for naught as Undertaker got the chair from him and hit Rikishi with it. Austin backs off while Undertaker put Rikishi's arm in the chair and did the arm breaker deal. When the cameras were off, Undertaker chokeslammed Rikishi and posed for a long time. SmackDown is being moved to 7 p.m. on Thursday nights on The Score in Canada, which is 1 hour earlier than in the US because UPN is available in Canada in cities near the border. The belief is Score is losing some potential viewership by it being split, so Score, which is partially owned by WWF, is hoping the move will help increase the Canadian numbers. They also do a replay at 11 p.m. SmackDown on April 26th, taped 2 days earlier in Denver. A lot more of a wrestling-oriented show than has been the case with WWF of late. However, no main event during sweeps may not be the best policy. The surprise didn't work, although had they announced Austin and Triple H versus Kaientai, that would have been a worse idea. Regal and Angle beat Jericho and Benoit in 10:53, which must be the longest opening match on WWF TV in probably close to a year. Great match. Superheat. It was Duchess of Queensberry rules, which were never explained. Everyone got their key spots in. Finally, Regal and Angle both double-teamed Jericho with submissions and the ref called for a DQ.
Regal then explained the rules in a tag team match are that double submissions are legal. Maybe they meant Duchess of Guadalajara rules, so that they won the match.
Vince told Triple H and Austin he had a secret team for them to face. They weren't happy.
Matt Hardy beat Guerrero for the European title in 7-18.
Pretty good match.
Saturn and Jeff Hardy fought outside the ring.
Finish saw Lita do a Hurricane Rana on Guerrero off the top rope, and Matt got the pin with a twist of fate. They did the big kiss scene afterwards. Edge and Christian went to Regal, which ended up changing the pay-per-view to Matt vs. Guerrero vs. Christian for the European title since Christian claimed his grandfather was from Luxembourg, and to throw Raven a bone, they put him with Rhino for the hardcore title. Kane beat Edge and Christian via DQ in 5:37. Old school style, mainly working on Kane's left elbow. Good match as well. They did a concerto to the elbow for the DQ but left Kane laying.
Even though it was 2-on-1, it was elevation for Edge and Christian to a point in that they came out of the deal looking strong. There was a backstage scene where Deborah was sent out for coffee by Stephanie. She came back and threw the coffee all over Austin. It was funny because Michael Cole during the show tried to portray it as Austin getting out of control because he got so mad just because his wife accidentally spilled coffee, and they later even showed a replay making it clear she threw it on him. If it was supposed to be an accident, it was terrible acting on Deborah's part. If it wasn't, then they sure made Cole to look like a goof. Rhino beat Test in a hardcore title match in 4:55. They used the garbage can and fire extinguisher in front of the crowd before going backstage. Test did the dreaded death kick into a garbage can into Rhino's face. Show wound up in one of the storage locations in the building and smashed Test twice into a garage door, and Rhino got the pin. Show after the match choke slammed Test through cardboard. After the first 2 weeks, ratings came in after all the network promotion. UPN was clearly desperate about Chains of Love. WWF did them a favor doing a spoof of the show with Blackman handcuffed to 4 large women. Segment was hilarious with GMS talking in that GMS slang saying he went to get 4 fat women to handcuff to Steve, but somehow they wound up with 4 fat women.
See, this proves Russo's point. WWF was allowed to call women fat, and that's why they still draw sellout houses.
GMS threw chocolate on the ground and the women all dived for it.
Then the least attractive starting hitting on Blackman. Except for the first 2 matches. This was the best thing on the show. X Factor did an interview. Credible claimed he ran the Dudleys out of ECW. Eventually the Dudleys came out. First, Dudleys did an interview on the stage where he said Big Daddy Dudley always told him to keep his friends close and his enemies closer. I guess that means Big Daddy Dudley has finally been revealed to be Buddy Rogers. They did a 6-way which ended with Spike doing the acid drop, which on SmackDown seems to be called the Dudley Dong, on Credible. Then they did the Was Up on Albert and a 3D on X-Pac. Undertaker beat all 4 members of RTC. When they finally beat him down, Richards wanted the pin. The other 3 got mad and walked out and just stood there in the aisle while Taker gave Richards a high kick and a last ride. Shane did a poem about how he was going to beat Show at the pay-per-view. Austin and Triple H's foes turned out to be Kaientai, but Taker and Kane came out and ended the show pounding on Austin and Triple H. The Braverman/Bloom Talent Agency has sued Joan Laurer, China, for skipping out on commissions since she left their management. Laurer was under contract to Barry Bloom as an agent from March 1998 through December 2000, during which time they negotiated her WWF contract and advised and counseled her on all her entertainment matters including acting, Playboy in her fitness video and best-selling autobiography. The suit said that when Laurer terminated the contract in December, she allegedly agreed to pay $10,400 she still owed them plus continue to pay them their percentage for the Playboy deal, her autobiography, her fitness video and a television project called Longings of Lolly that was part of. The lawsuit claims Laurer owes them on their percentage of those deals between $150,000 and $250,000. The lawsuit says she hasn't responded to numerous attempts they've made to contact her and has refused to pay. The lawsuit was filed by attorney Henry Holmes, who is best known in wrestling as Terry Bollea's representative. Lawler wrote a long website article regarding the controversy over things he said on the Mancow show. Lawler said nothing on the show was meant to be taken seriously and said anyone listening should have been able to tell it was all in jest, but it was reported as serious news on the internet that he implied Bruce Pritchard and Stephanie McMahon were sleeping together and that he wouldn't care if Vince died in a car wreck. He said he doesn't hate Vince, he isn't even mad at him right now, and didn't mean to imply Pritchard was sleeping with Stephanie but said it may have come across on the show like he did. He also denied another reported story that Carter's firing may have been because of a photo she was showing around of her and Chyna kissing and that it upset Chyna. Lawler said the photo was taken on February 2, 2000 and had been up on Lawler's website since March, and the two weren't kissing in the photo, they were mugging for the camera.
He said China shouldn't have been upset by the photo since she was posing for them.
Lawler said he has more than $1 million in cash and doesn't need to beg for his job back. He said he doesn't even know if he'd go back at this point if Vince begged him. Lawler said that WWF attorneys have told his attorneys that he's burning his bridges by talking about the situation in the media, and said they were more concerned about the internet than radio and TV. He said he's not saying anything that isn't the truth, and if the truth hurts, that's not my problem, and said he can't understand why WWF pulled the developmental wrestlers away from Randy Hales and PPW because Hales wanted to use him on the show and then fired him from his deal with them. He claimed wrestlers have been told they'll be fired if they talk with him or Carter, and that an independent promoter in Fort Lauderdale he was working for told him that wrestlers had been told they would never have a chance to work for the WWF if they worked on that show because Lawler and Carter were appearing. He also mentioned that months ago, he had met with Hugh Hefner and Hefner brought up Carter appearing in the magazine.
Actually, there was heat over Lawler trying to get Carter in the magazine because the WWF felt it was their domain to determine which WWF women were to get into the magazine.
This past week, Carter received a rejection notice from the magazine, but the letter also stated if the WWF relationship with Playboy does not go forward, they might change their minds. Lawler complained he hadn't gotten paid for the book Christmas Chaos that he did the artwork for, and said he's very close to signing a major publishing deal for an autobiography. He also said his schedule now and working indies is more fun. Lawler has talked with Hogan about doing a match at the Mid-South Coliseum when they get new TV and doing a territory around Memphis like the old days.
Big Show did a TNN interview and talked about how Jim Cornette, when he was in OVW, would find guys if a face and heel were having dinner together.
He didn't even go far enough. Cornette would blow a gasket if he heard a face and a heel were even hanging out, even if they weren't together in the same nightclub. After the 30th anniversary in Louisville show, where most of the wrestlers on the show attended a party that was closed off to the public, he sort of gave people a reprieve over them being in the same party, but was unhappy because there was a door to the nightclub itself where regular partygoers were that occasionally opened so people in the city would actually be able to see faces and heels work together at a party. He said the word he said about Kaientai was goofs, said the people doing the pre-taped interview knew he said it, which was why it aired, but the people in the truck freaked out and bleeped it, and when it was bleeped, everyone thought he made a racial slur. Eric Butterbean Esch did an interview for Boxing Monthly, a UK boxing publication, who said that Rock and Steve Austin had a bet with each other on the outcome of his WrestleMania match against Bart Gunn. Rock won the bet. He said that in 1998, when he was at the peak of his cult celebrityhood, McMahon made a huge offer to bring him in full-time, with him claiming it was near 7 figures. I find that hard to believe, but who knows? But that he turned it down because he still wanted to continue boxing, since he was getting big paydays with it. Vince wouldn't allow it because he was worried in boxing, his rep could be destroyed at any point in time with a loss. UPW, the WWF developmental territory in Southern California, ran its monthly Big Show on April 25th in Santa Ana, California before a sellout 700+ at the Galaxy Theater. We did the Observer Live show from the building before the show in that building for the second time. Edge and Christian worked the main event beating Evolution, Frankie Kazarian and Nova being put together as a regular tag team because of similar look. The other WWF performer brought in was Molly Holly, who put over Victoria, who started her career there. This was the worst match on the show. Victoria comes across like a real athlete who can do a good promo in her look and not like one of those WWF women that look like they shouldn't be in the ring once the match starts. That isn't saying she's good or she's ready, although she's improved a lot according to everyone, but she has the look of a fit athlete, strong legs and back, as opposed to the starved out fake huge boobs look. She really had far more true charisma than Molly, although Molly came across to the crowd as a superstar because she's on WWF TV. But she got booed for not laying her kicks in at all, and for slipping off the ropes when going for a moonsault finisher. Samoa Joe beat Tommy Dreamer to keep the UPW title. Dreamer put him over clean in the middle. Most interesting was a spot where Joe, the heel, grabbed a chair and was about to hit Dreamer. He paused, then put the chair down and smirked, and it actually got the most heel heat of the match because the crowd was mad they didn't get to see Dreamer hit with a chair. It's strange in logic, but in current logic of what fans want, it made perfect sense and obviously the spot worked great. Prototype, who was working his final show with the group before leaving for Ohio Valley in about 2 weeks, did an angle where several heels led by Joe attacked him and did the broken arm deal with a chair. They pounded on him a while until Dreamer made the save. Few knew about it, but the original plan was that Rock would show up as a surprise and save Prototype since he's staying in Los Angeles doing acting classes. But it just didn't get worked out at the last minute. Kinda funny that they'd have Rock at the show and keep it a surprise for the pop when publicizing him being there could have gotten the company tons of local media attention, but since it was never finalized, I guess they couldn't really do much with it. With the exception of the Edge and Christian match, the best match on the show was four unknown rookies that on paper looked to have no business even having a match together. Nathan Jones, who is a legit 6'10" and well over 300 and I'd say would be a sure bet to be a superstar barring injury, although his age, he's 30, could possibly work against him, although many who have started older have made it, and Kurt Angle wasn't much younger when he started. He has the size, the look, incredible charisma, and can even do a promo, and is clearly a good athlete with great agility for his size to go along with being legitimately one of the strongest men on the planet. WWF signed him up before he ever had his first match, and he's probably only had a half dozen. His partner, Johnny Heidenreich, a former pro football player who is probably 6'7" or 6'8" and is an even thicker bodybuilder, although he doesn't have as much natural charisma, took on two guys who were about 5'6" with no physiques called Gorgeous and Young, GAY, doing the gay act. Their real names are Paul Riggs and J.C. Collins, and even though they did the act, and it looked like Kaientai against Undertaker and Kane, and the big guys sold a lot, if anything, more than they should have, and got squashed at the end, the crowd gave them a huge ovation and chanted GAY like it was ECW or something at the end because the two were so entertaining. Should also mention an angle done with Adam Pearce, who just moved from Chicago, and is a hell of a talker, with Josh Wilcox, the member of the Los Angeles Extreme of the XFL who did the People's Elbow after scoring a touchdown a few days earlier in the championship game. Wilcox did a great job staying with Pearce in the angle to set up a match on May 30th in the same building. The angle got over really strong. The Ballards also looked real good in the opener and were involved in the finish of the main event as they seemed to be building toward Evolution vs. Ballards as the big tag team program. Christopher Daniels ran the shows backstage, and many call them the best indie shows in the country. Both Jim Ross and Bill Moody, Paul Bearer, from WWF were there, Moody as the agent for the WWF talent, and Ross came to the show since he was in Los Angeles meeting with WCW talent. Ross was very impressed by the show itself and how it's put together. Ross told the WCW talent, in particular Chavo Guerrero Jr., Sean O'Hare and Chuck Palumbo, who all live in Southern California, that he wanted them to work as many indie dates as possible before the relaunch and asked UPW promoter Rick Baseman to book all three on his future shows. Baseman was on Wrestling Observer Live the next day and said UPW was working on the Bun and Murray deal for a reality-based wrestling television show, similar to a concept they at one point were working with ECW with for USA Network, and said he had a deal with ABC for it to be a primetime show, saying the network wanted a lot of reality shows ready in case of the TV writers' strike. Michael Modest was scheduled to work the show, even though he's already been told he's being let go by the old WCW, and WWF appears to have no interest in him. His WCW contract doesn't get cycled out until May 3rd, and they wouldn't allow him to work the show. More Ross report notes not involving the relaunch, which has been his main duty getting that together for the past few weeks. Said Rock would return at some point in the summer. Basically his return is whenever they finish filming Scorpion King. Praised Victoria, Edge and Christian and Nova for their work at the UPW show. Put over the Van Dam negotiations strong. Angle had a stinger on April 23rd Raw and had numbness and tingling in his shoulder, but worked the next day and it went away later in the week. Saturn banged his forearm on the ring steps in working with Jeff Hardy outside the ring during the Matt title win over Guerrero. He's had trouble moving his wrist. X-rays were negative, although Saturn believes his arm is broken and will be seeing a doctor after TV this week. Regal took a bad bump on April 24th SmackDown, suffering a minor dislocated shoulder and a hyperextended elbow. Guerrero is having elbow problems and will be getting physical therapy. K-Quick has a pulled muscle in his back. Rodriguez strained his knee. Shooter Schultz had emergency surgery on April 23rd for a double hernia and will be out a few months. Hardcore Kid, Aaron Aguilera, had back surgery on May 1st and will be out 2 months. Flash is returning after elbow surgery. Charlie Haas has a severely sprained ankle. WWF is going to send a film crew to Stillwater, Oklahoma when Angle is inducted into the Amateur Wrestling Hall of Fame. Tough Enough concludes shooting on May 11th, after which, expect Snow, Tori and Jackie to be back on television. The show debuts on June 21st with a 1-hour special on MTV and will air in 12 30-minute blocks weekly after that. Bobby Eaton was fired as trainer in Memphis. Don't know why. WWF The Music dropped to number 97 for the week, selling 15,451 units.
Everything in the market dropped as it was the week after a big Easter week, which is traditional in that business, although proportionately, WWF dropped more, just as the week before. It picked up more than the market.
Howard Stern did his show on April 27 from WWF New York with Austin, Triple H and Iron Sheik in attendance for a mock boxing match with two of his characters. Triple H was said to be really funny and unintentionally. Sheik was even funnier as he challenged Bruno Sammartino, Andre the Giant and Sonny Beach, a prelim guy from the late 80s, to matches. Bob Holly, whose gimmick in the WWF was that he was race car driver Thuman Sparky Plug of Talladega, Alabama at one point, raced in Southampton Motor Speedway in Capron, Virginia on April 20th, announced as Bob Holly of Mobile, Alabama, as opposed to his real name, and had finished 18th in the 24-car field. He's going to race again on the same track on May 11th.
Former Stampede wrestlers Bill Yates, Greg Pavlik, who was compared to a very young Chris Benoit about 18 months ago when he had a WCW tryout, and Highlander of Western Canadian
Extreme Wrestling, all started with Stampede but left over money issues, will be getting tryouts when WWF tapes TV in Alberta at the end of the month. The Backlash show that aired on Channel 4 in the UK on a 50-minute delay screwed up the order of matches, airing Benoit vs. Angle before Jericho vs. Regal. After airing the Jericho match, they started the video airing before the Benoit match and stopped it in mid-transmission when someone figured out they already aired the match. The Vince/show segment aired twice. They also took commercial breaks at times in mid-sentence between matches. UPN 9 in New York, in their weekly post-SmackDown WWF news story, did an interview with Road Dogg. He mentioned in the piece he was getting divorced and blamed himself for the problems. Besides the drug issues that he's already publicly acknowledged, when the WWF fired him, they were very concerned about his family situation.
WWF was dominant in the sports video charts with the New Divas video at number 1, followed by Best of Raw, No Way Out and Royal Rumble, before the highest-ranking non-pro wrestling video being Michael Jordan to the Max.
ECW's New Deep Impact and Barely Legal tapes came in at number 7 and number 8, which were the only non-WWF pro wrestling tapes on the charts. In all, 8 of the top 10 tapes were wrestling and 16 of the top 20, 14 of which were WWF. They were confiscating signs at TV again this week. The major ones were those involving characters of the old WCW, such as NUFO and drawings of Triple H with a Hulkamania shirt on. There are only 3 actual house shows during the month of May. This coming weekend has no house shows because of insurrection. The following weekend only has 1 house show booked, Columbus, Ohio, instead of the usual 3. The weekend after is the Judgment Day pay-per-view. The weekend after that is Memorial Day and they are running Salt Lake City and Vancouver. There is clearly a cutback because in June there is only 1 day on the schedule, June 10th, where they are doing what had been the regular Sunday split cruise. NBC, with the movie Golden Eyes, did a 4.5 rating on April 21st, more than double what the XFL games were doing at the end. SmackDown tapings on April 24th in Denver drew a sellout 13,313, paying $417,654. Raw tapings on April 30th in Milwaukee drew a sellout 13,438, paying $393,780. Arena merchandise for the week not including the pay-per-view was $215,034 or $8.09 per head. This is the Pro Wrestle Machine,